this? I don't know. It's me. It's Amid the Ruins. It's a guy who makes dire wave music. It's Amid the Ruins. Dire wave music. What I've talked about in, probably 100 articles at Jay's Analysis is the implementation of the AI smart grid and the giant smart cities, which is what IBM talks about publicly building. And that's where we're going, and that's what I think we have to be really concerned about. So all of these tensions, they are part of a long-term strategy to basically get everybody moved into mega cities. They'll be forced off of land and so forth for environmental reasons, and basically concocted and invented environmental nonsense. Then you'll be stuck in some hellhole mega city in a, basically a carton-size apartment living over a Target or something, or inside of a Target or a Walmart, as I said several years ago. It's actually coming true now. There's actually Target cities. This is all part of the long-term globalist strategy. So, but to get there, you've got to have the constant clash, the constant alchemical blending and mixing and smashing together right out of Manichaeanism to produce the convergence, to produce the synthesis. And that's what's crucial in all this, and what is absolutely true from an alchemical, esoteric, philosophical, and geopolitical perspective, the fact that the ruling elite seek to be post-human. jaysanalysis.com. fix today's problems politically. And this is what so many people in alt circles and alt-right and alt-whatever and alt-media, they all seem to think that there's like a political solution to man's problems. And really the whole of modernity is built on this neo-pagan concept of political salvation. And there is no political salvation for man. All right, welcome. It's time for this late evening, early evening, late evening, early late evening. This is brunch, the evening inverse brunch for night owls. Did I turn the music off? Yeah. All right, everybody hear me good? Let's turn that up. Everybody always bitching. All right, so I've been wanting to cover this book for a long time. Now is the appropriate time. Now that we're beginning to have a lot of fruitful conversations, actually, with traditional Catholics and Thomists, finally. So we have multiple lengthy, fruitful conversations today in the Discord, so I'm glad for that. Glad that we can have conversations on a friendly level without getting too, and even heated, passionate discussions without getting too angry or whatever. As we get to the end of tonight's talk, I'm going to open up the Discord for people who want to do Q&A. If you want to come on audio-wise and answer from the Discord, you can come on and ask questions, or I'll just read the questions from the Discord. So you don't have to come on if you don't want to. But if you guys are in the Discord and you want to ask questions towards the end, I'm going to give priority to the Super Chat questions. And so, welcome everybody to tonight's stream. So we're going to be talking about the excellent Wemhoff book that I've talked about for a long time. John Courtney Murray, Time Life Magazine, and the American Proposition. Now, a little bit of background. If you're a trad, as I was a trad for many years, then you typically believe in the narrative that something like this happened. Basically, around the time of the Enlightenment, after the Reformation, the ideals of the Protestant world of the Enlightenment, humanism, essentially came to dominate and subvert, principally through a lot of secret societies and cults like Freemasonry. So the trad narrative is that groups like Freemasonry subverted the church from within, and eventually got it to accept more and more liberal policies, like under the time of Pius X, modernism, hence provoking Pius to write Pacendi, Lamentabili, these different documents that condemn the presuppositions of modernism. And this Masonic subversion, however, was such that by the time of Vatican II, it had gained sway. Right, so pretty much gained sway, and then all the various trads can debate to what degrees they believe Vatican II was or was not influenced by Freemasonry and liberalism, or what Leo XIII in his encyclical on Freemasonry calls organized naturalism, right? Humanum Janus, which is the encyclical relating to the condemnation of Freemasonry, famously by Leo XIII. And now I've covered all that stuff for a long time, but I'm just pointing this out, that this is the trad version. And I bought into this version for a long time because it makes, in a lot of ways, it makes sense, and it's not all wrong, right? By the way, if you do want to ask Super Chat questions, you can ask them there through the Streamlabs to support the show. But there are a couple books that came along. I mean, I was already kind of out of Roman Catholicism into Orthodoxy when I was beginning to lean away from this, and I started looking at more bigger geopolitical types of stuff. But along came Michael Hoffman's book, Occult Renaissance Church of Rome, and David Wemhoff's book, John Courtney Murray, Time Life Magazine, The American Proposition, how the CIA's doctrinal warfare program changed the Catholic Church. And basically, this one gives the argument that it's not really the fault solely of modern Judaism or Freemasonry, that trads are really deluding themselves because they're not being honest with the Renaissance and medieval papacy, which had far more power and influence during that time period than Jews did. So really, there's no one to blame other than the papacy itself for the failure of Latin Catholicism. So I think Hoffman sets out to show that thesis with the Renaissance. All right, so Hoffman doesn't deal with any of the issues of the first 1,000 years of Christianity. He's not concerned with the first millennium. He's not competent in that area. But that's only part of the picture again, because it's not just spiritual and ideological battles. This is a very autistic, kind of idealistic, young guy's approach to things. Like, I'll read all the books and then I'll understand the pure ideology that led to XYZ. Now, there are ideological trends that happen in history that lead to this and that event. Obviously, humanism led to the Enlightenment, right? There's nothing out of accord with that, right? I've argued for a long time that I think absolute divine simplicity caused a lot of the problems in Western thought. But there's other factors that come into play, and as you get older, you realize that history and these kinds of things are more nuanced. And you get into geopolitics, and geopolitics is one of the big factors that has a huge impact on these issues. Now, I'm not going to be a reductionist and smush everything into geopolitics, right? I'm not going to smush everything into a battle of ideals like an idealist would do. I'm not going to make it all a conspiracy as a conspiracy theorist would do. So the important point of this book is to stress that this is not a conspiracy text. This is a scholarly text written by a Catholic lawyer, himself a person in communion with, as far as I know, Francis. David Wemhoff is a normal trad, quote normal trad Catholic, who affirms the authority and accepts Vatican II and the popes, but admits at the same time that they were subverted. Now, I don't think that that's a tenable position. Obviously, I'm Orthodox, but that's not really what we're going to be looking at today. This is not a talk about whether Vatican I and Vatican II are consistent. We're going to be talking about we will get into some theology because it comes into play in the book, but this is a geopolitical analysis of the forces and factors involved in Vatican II. And another reason we want to look at this angle is that one of the common refrains, that's one of the more low IQ responses to orthodoxy, is, haha, you guys are the church of Caesaropapism. At Constantinople, because of you had an imperial church and you couldn't fight the Saracens and so forth. All this nonsense, right? Because when Roman Catholics are said to be dealing with problems, right? If we talk about the pedo crisis in the Roman Catholic Church, we have the pedo crisis because we're the true church. Oh, really? But when it's our church that has problems, if we collapse in Byzantium, it's because of our sins. You see the moving the goalposts there, the special pleading. So the problems in the church can just be read and reinterpreted into whatever you want them to be. Now, these are kind of low IQ arguments that dumber people make, but they do come up a lot. And what we're going to very quickly see is that, as we saw in the talk with Sneck on the Franks, the entity of the Vatican as an entity of geopolitics, and thus papalocesarism, as I will call it, is just as much a problem and just as much a inverse problem as their accusation of the Orthodox Church being Caesaropapist. This is demonstrable proof with 850 pages and some 1,000 footnotes. So here's a lawyer. You guys love your papal lawyering. Here's a lawyer in the Catholic tradition traditional Catholic, arguing that essentially the Roman Catholic Church, a little bit prior to, but mainly manifested in Vatican II, is an engine of Americanism and the CIA for the Cold War. It's that simple. John Courtney Murray being one of these key agents, along with C.D. Jackson, who came up with this doctrinal warfare program on the part of the CIA. Henry Luce of Time Life magazine, Skull and Bones, who basically worked together with his wife, Claire Booth Luce, a convert to Catholicism, to convince the American Catholics, and I'm speaking here of the prominent ones, to influence people in the Vatican to accept a lot of the American ideas. Americanism. Now, what do we mean by Americanism? We're talking about here the notions of Enlightenment philosophies, right? Natural rights. Now, again, I'm going to argue there is a connection between the Thomistic doctrines of natural right and the American Enlightenment doctrines of natural rights. The libertarian ethos and spirit, the atomistic individualism, religious liberty, religious freedom, freedom of conscience, freedom of worship, secularism, secular states, religious pluralism. These are all fundamental components of America and Americanism. That whatever you believe on those positions, maybe you agree with them, maybe you reject them. The point here is just to analyze the arguments that Wemhoff puts forth for how the Roman Catholic Church was essentially subverted. Now look at these clowns on YouTube like Tim Flanders and Taylor Milkers, by the way, who now says he has visions of the church with big gazumbas, literally squirting milk, and the milk is either pure, it's pure and impure at the same time, and he says Mary gave him these visions and all this nonsense. Look at the people that you're following, right? What does Flanders do? He leaves Orthodoxy to convert to Catholicism. He goes on Taylor Marshall, talks about how dumb Orthodoxy is and gives all these prelest-based answers. And then his hero, Taylor, is out here talking about how Roman Catholicism is proven, or his new SSPX-ish position that he's got, by the Milkers vision that he got. I mean, I'm sorry, but you guys follow that? That's on you. Look at what you're following here. And ironically, Flanders just had Wemhoff on. I don't know how he thinks this helps his case. This helps our case. So I don't know how you're trying to spin that. Maybe he was doing a little bit of, let's maybe take some of this, the fire of this argument away from Jay maybe, and show that, well, you don't have to, you can read Wemhoff's book and, still accept Vatican II. Just interpret it in the conservative way. Really? How do you interpret Nostra Aetate in union with Cantate Domino? Yeah, that doesn't work. How is religious liberty a heresy? And then within 60 years, it's the work of the Spirit. Yeah, exactly. But so what Wemhoff is going to do here in his excellent book, and by the way, the link to the book is in the show description. If you want to get the book, there is the link to, it is, I think, about $50 because it's a big, fat, hardback book. But get it from this link, because I will get a cut if you get it from that link. Wemhoff begins by talking about Thomas Paine. Now, if we think about founding ideologues of America, right? We think of Jefferson. We think of Jefferson borrowing from John Locke. We think of Locke's empiricism. We think of, utilitarianism. We think of common sense philosophy. Right? Thomas Paine, common sense. If I'm not incorrect, I think Thomas Paine's books used to have a square and compass on the front of the books. I'm pretty sure I've read that. But regardless, the philosophy of Thomas Paine in common sense is completely antithetical to what is supposed to be traditional Catholicism. Now, again, we're not here to talk about the traditional Orthodox position on church-state relations. I did a whole 3-hour talk on that. Go listen to that. Today, we're just going to be looking at pre-Vatican II and post-Vatican II Catholic teaching on the role of church and state and the forces within the U.S., the geopolitical forces, especially during the Cold War, that were able to utilize the Roman Catholic Church as an instrument of Americanism. Now, I'm not saying that means that the West was the bad guy in the Cold War and that therefore now Sovietism and communism are the good guys. Okay, so again, do not stop accusing me of this stupid dialectic where people say, oh, you are a KGB Duganist. We're going to cover all of that and show how silly that is today with Wemhoff's book. Now, after he talks about the essential argument of Thomas Paine that government is secular, the American ideologically must universally apply then this secular argument to give birth to a new world. So Wemhoff is correctly arguing that within the assumptions of the American liberal ideology, it of necessity has the impetus to universalize, colonize the rest of the world with its liberal ideology. It's inherent in the system. Now, at the time, so back in the 1800s, this is funny. There were still a lot of Roman Catholic traditional mindsets that critiqued this Enlightenment ideology, even of Americanism in the 1800s. Even though there were already Americanist Roman Catholics like the Carroll family, who signed on to, basically America's founding, even though they accepted religious liberty and these principles, there were Catholics like Bishop Joseph Fessler, 1813 to 1872, Secretary of Vatican I, that called this secular Enlightenment American principle heathen Caesarism. So remember, that's heathen Caesarism according to one of the presiding bishops of Vatican I. So he goes on to talk about what would be the means by which the American ideology would, from the late 1800s, again, birthed out of the Enlightenment, it would take a lot of time to suffuse the Catholic world in the West with these Enlightenment principles. Ironically, even though the Roman Catholic natural law principles themselves are what give rise to this whole position. Now, Wemhoff doesn't believe that because he's, of course, a faithful traditional Catholic. But I will argue that. I will argue in my further analysis of the book that the only reason that the Roman Catholic Church ends up in this difficult question between natural rights theology, natural rights philosophy, is because of the dogmatic acceptance of Thomistic philosophy and the whole distinction between natural theology and revealed theology, which is, again, not the Orthodox position. The American ideology, he says, is part of liberalism. It is the Anglo-American liberal tradition. It is part and parcel of the Enlightenment, right? Now listen to this argumentation at the beginning. The capitalist spirit seeks the reduction or elimination of hindrances to the spreading of the capitalist spirit. That means that the reduction of barriers to markets, the free flow of capital and commerce must be maintained. That is the internal impetus of the system. That is the system, furthering the system for its own systemic goals. Those best situated to gain from the capitalist spirit and to increase in society are the most powerful individuals or groups in society, given these financial powers and interests. So the financial interest comes to dominate in this system, and therefore it has the impetus to extend this system everywhere. One of the barriers to this system is to eliminate a state-connected church. Church and state must be divided. What does Konstantin Pabianatsev, the famous Russian statesman, say? Remember what he argues? At the very beginning of Reflections of a Russian Statesman? What does he say? He says, if you separate church and state, you don't actually get freedom. You get a state that becomes the church. The state now dictates what is the true religion, namely statism. But I love the fact that at the beginning, he noted he mentions a Catholic philosopher, an Italian statesman named Amintore Fanfani. Tony, third cousin of Tony Soprano. He's the third fucking cousin of Tony Soprano. Okay, what are you talking about here? What are you talking about, huh? You talking about Amintore Fanfani. He argued that this society necessitates the capitalist spirit spreading, since it is essentially the grounding principle of the society, and so therefore it necessitates liberalism. So you can't combine the older Catholic ideas of monarchy or imperium, Holy Roman Empire, at the same time as maintaining Enlightenment liberal ideology. They're two different. They don't make sense together, you'd say. Now, I'm not saying that there couldn't theoretically be systems where maybe there's a monarchy where you have a freer market. I mean, perhaps in theory, there's people who speculate on that kind of thing, like Hoppe. But at least historically, this is a difficult oil and water to try to mix together. Because if you have a king or a monarchy and a state, they typically want to limit economic situations such as importation of goods so that it doesn't wreck their economy, so that certain trades are not destroyed by cheap goods, right? So hence tariffs, right? I'm not saying that any of these systems is ideal. I'm just talking about the pros and the cons of different types of systems that you go with here. Anyway, moving on, he says in the beginning, he lays out the thesis. Wemhoff says, look, if we want to try to trace the intelligence apparatus influence, the geopolitical influence at Vatican II, contrary to the common narratives and myths of trads, which myth itself is part of the Cold War mythology, the idea that the Catholic Church has to be a bastion of Americanism to combat Sovietism, that, he argues, is part of the Cold War concocted psychological warfare narrative. That is the narrative and myth that the trad swallows that he doesn't understand. So were there subversive Masons and other groups? Sure, of course. But that's only part of the picture. Because there is a more powerful group utilizing and steering the Roman Catholic Church into being an engine of Americanism. And the CIA doing this, especially during the Cold War. And guess what? This explanation lines up perfectly with explaining today's geopolitics. It's not any different. Why do you think Ratzinger stepped down? Why do you think Francis affirms all the globalist institutions and full-on globalism, as even the most liberal Catholics admit? Because of this explanation, okay? If the trad narrative is true, are you seriously going to try to argue to me that Francis is a KGB agent? Really? So Putin and Francis are teamed up, to get Trump elected? So now you believe the Democrat narrative and story? This is the New York Times narrative stuff, right? Is that what you... Really? Come on. No, it's not the KGB that co-opted the papacy. That's the false trad narrative. The CIA co-opted the papacy, hence why the papacy sided with and did what the CIA wanted during the Cold War under the auspices of fighting the Soviets and the Marxists. But that came at a price, even though the Soviets are bad guys, right? Absolutely, the communists were evil. Absolutely, they were doing horrible things to persecute the church, murdering millions of Russian Christians and Orthodox martyrs, and even Roman Catholics being murdered and tortured. Absolutely. But that's not all there is to the narrative or to this dialectical story. And we can demonstrate it. That's the thing here. It's no longer theorizing and conspiracy theorizing about, well, maybe there was the Alta Vendita that took over. No. We don't have to theorize about that anymore, because now we know specifically who, when, where, and how the church was taken over and subverted to become an engine, and is still an engine of this power structure. The same power structure, the Anglo-American power structure. And guess who David Wemhoff goes to first in his book? The first chapters, the Anglo-American establishment, and they're taking the Wasp Alliance, America, England, Israel, taking over the Catholic Church. Where does Wemhoff prove this? Tragedy and Hope, Carol Quigley, everything you've heard me talk about. This is what broke me out of my stupid trad mythology, beginning to read these books, you see, and realizing the trad story doesn't add up. I mean, if the trad story was true, when the wall fell and when communism fell, we should have seen the explosion, right, of trad Catholicism everywhere. Wouldn't we have seen that? But no, we get Western liberalism exploding everywhere. Exactly what Quigley said was the whole goal, right? Tragedy is the two world wars. Hope is the democratic capitalism, liberalism that would be spread to the rest of the world, according to Quigley. That's what the title of the book. Writing from the CFR archives, writing from the Anglo-American establishment power structures archives. But what happens after the fall of the wall? Liberalism. Today's Vatican. Is it trad? No. Nobody will say this. Nobody in the world will say that today's Vatican is trad. So how did this happen? Putin? Moscow? Really? No. The same power structure that co-opted the church in the 60s, the CIA, is still the same power structure that can blackmail high-powered clerics into resigning. AKA everything that came out during Benedict's resignation about how he had better resign, or there would be a lot more hell to pay in his church. Now, that doesn't mean that Ratzinger is some hero saint, bulldog of traditionalism. Yeah, right. Give me a break. I mean, have you read his books? Like, he denies the bodily resurrection. I mean, this guy is total modernist, but he played the role well, I guess, of a pseudo-traditionalist. But even that was not what the elite, financial, Rockefeller, banking, Western elite establishment wanted. But let's rewind before we get to that to setting the stage for how this occurred with the OSS. The OSS is the predecessor, 1941-42. The OSS comes into being in 1942. It's the predecessor to the CIA. And he begins his book talking about Henry Luce, right? So a lot of the people that would go into the CIA, be important people in media, advertising, Mad Men type stuff, Walter Lippmann, consulting agencies. They were people in the OSS, right? And that's where he begins his treatise, March 1948, The American Century, right? Time magazine puts out Henry Luce, Wasp, preeminent Skull and Bones member Wasp. Henry Luce was American of American, could trace his lineage back to the American Revolution. He invented the news magazine with founding Time magazine. With the mentoring of OSS agent Walter Lippmann, Luce put into practice the emerging science of psychological manipulation. They had learned these techniques from their wartime experience that they took from psychological warfare and put into mass media and advertising. How many times have you heard me say this? Countless, throughout Bernays and all the global elite books that we've done. With his magazine, Luce would come to be one of the most powerful, influential men. William Hearst, right? He's like the Hearst, right? So you go watch Citizen Kane type of guy, right? And his goal would be to essentially be an evangelist of the American ideology. By 1941, Americans had a motive, opportunity, and means to go global with the American revolutionary ideology and project. Right? FDR gave his famous Four Freedoms speech. The Four Freedoms meaning the ideology that must be extended to the rest of the world. The American goals. The American ideology. Freedom of speech, freedom, all this kind of stuff, right? To do this, it was necessary for Americanism to go global, to create the American century, and to defeat the fascists. Okay, so Mussolini, Germany, Japan, they got to go because they represent the counter doctrines to American liberalism, the 1941 Four Freedoms speech. This is also exactly consistent with what Quigley says when Quigley says that it was the CFR who made the decision to move the U.S. from being a production-based economy and a non-interventionist type of state to expansion into imperial colony type setup and interventionism, foreign wars and entanglements, and America moving away from production economy to a kind of center of the global empire, colonial center model, imperial colonial center model. And that was the CFR that made the decision to move America in that way. And of course, the world wars, according to Quigley, were a big part of being able to do that. So America then stood for freedom, material prosperity, and happiness, the Happy Meal principle. Soviets then, in this story, this narrative, reflected tyranny, materialism, and the collapsing of the individual. So that's what follows this World War II era. And this was what was used as part of the propaganda to get the U.S. into World War II. Again, read Quigley. Was that the four freedoms we got to fight for the freedom across the globe, right? Because how else will everybody have the right to put pee-pee and poo-poo? You see, we got to spread freedom to the rest of the globe. So World War II sets the stage for the four freedoms, and then what follows World War II, as we all know, World War III, aka the Cold War. So the Cold War becomes, again, the narrative of spreading the American democratic Enlightenment freedoms against tyranny, collective materialism, and the smothering of the individual. In the religious sphere, and by the way, remember that we saw this in many of the global elites that we read. We saw it in, I think it's the beginning of Between Two Ages. Brzezinski says we've got to energize and utilize the institution of the Catholic Church. It's an already awesomely existing international institution that we can marshal into being a propaganda outlet for Americanism. This is the missing element in a lot of the trad narratives and explanations of Vatican II. Not all of them. Some of them have grasped this. Solange Hertz grasped this, to be fair. But they missed that Vatican II wasn't just a subverting of the papacy or whatever. Vatican II was a turning of the papacy into an engine of Americanism. That's the whole plan here. It's not a conspiracy plot. It's an open plot. They openly said, let's do this. They didn't hide, we got to hide and secretly figure out how to use Freemasons to do. No. They openly said the Roman Catholic Church needs to be an international evangelizing institution for Americanism. So then he goes on to talk about the important characters here. Claire Booth Luce, who was also a spy. Claire Brokaw became Henry Luce's second wife. She converted to Catholicism in 1946 as a congresswoman. Now, this is where she began her dialogues and interactions with Fulton Sheen. All right. She credited Fulton Sheen with her conversion to Catholicism. And this immediately began a debate and a dialogue on the issue of religious liberty and disestablishmentarianism, right? Because if her wife is the preeminent Wasp Americanist, and she's going to convert to Catholicism, supposedly under the influence of Fulton Sheen. Remember when trads were making fun of me? They made the meme, which I think the meme is funny, about Fulton Sheen essentially promoting and propping up the CIA narrative, but basically being a kind of a CIA asset, if he wasn't full on in the CIA. Well, where do you think I got it? You think I just made that up? I'm getting it from Wemhoff, talking about the letters that he exchanged back and forth between Clare Boothe Luce. They have letters that they wrote back and forth. Go read them. But what Clare came to understand in these dialogues was that it's inherent in the nature of America to be inescapably pragmatic. However, she thought, I do believe that Roman Catholicism is the one true faith. But she was intent upon somehow making these two mesh together. Years after World War II had passed, the bishops deferred to the theologians at the time of Vatican II, who, like John Courtney Murray, supported the American ideology and all that came along with it. But how can the American ideology be blended based on pragmatism with a faith that is supernatural and based on metaphysics and metaphysical realities? Of course, the next character would be John Courtney Murray, the famous Jesuit, who was a rabid ecumenist, one of the first interreligious proponents of ecumenism. So we're expanding not just to older ecumenism, which in Mortalium Animos is condemned as apostasy between even Christian sects. Now we're extending it to interfaith gatherings. So Murray would have interreligious ecumenist gatherings with other religions. No longer just... Now, where would he come up? Oh, because Jesuitism makes perfect sense with that. The Jesuit enculturation doctrine has always been doing this kind of stuff as a tool to bring anything and anyone back under the umbrella of the papacy. Regardless of whatever you believe, just believe the papacy. And to prove that, just look at the Uniates. The Uniates have for centuries been brought back into communion with Rome. They don't even care what theology you believe. You can reject Trent. You can reject Vatican I. You can reject Purgatory. You can believe that Palamas is a doctor of the church, or you don't have to. It doesn't matter. Just accept the papacy. And that's why the Jesuits were so useful as papal evangelizers. The next character would be C.D. Jackson of the CIA. And C.D. Jackson is who, well, OSS, but he would come up with the program of the Doctrinal Warfare Project. Right? So you've got your intelligence guy, C.D. Jackson, psychological warfare proponent, expert. He works with John Courtney Murray, the famous American Jesuit. And they're in line with Luce, Henry, and Clare to promote the Wasp Protestant Americanist doctrine, now through the Catholic Church. Now, there was a lot of reaction by Catholics. Again, not just in the 50s and 40s, but going back for decades. Papal encyclicals over and over and over, rejecting liberalism, rejecting this, rejecting that, rejecting Enlightenment ideas. Monsignor Fenton wrote that Pius IX had condemned infallibly all of the liberal presuppositions and the liberalism of Europe. With the passage of time, however, and Luce's continuing emphasis on the topic of church-state relations in his flagship magazine, Time magazine, Monsignor Fenton explains that Leo XIII's writings are completely applicable to America. Yes, have you read Leo XIII, where he says that Freemasonry is organized naturalism, and the ideas of organized naturalism, like freedom of worship, religious liberty, secular state, they're all condemned. However, World War II had recently ended, and the Americans could declare themselves the clear victors. American propaganda then and psychological operations were now being felt after World War II around the world. America increasingly appeared then as the what? The last great hope for humanity after 2 world wars. The tragedy of 2 world wars and the hope of Americanism being extended to the whole world. This is I mean, the whole book is just mind-blowing, but so get this. At the 3rd annual some ecumenical meeting that was CTSA that had John Courtney Murray there, at the end of June 1948, John Courtney Murray presented a paper called The Government Repression of Heresy. Oddly enough, Connell presented Murray's paper because, somebody represented him. A person named Connell presented John Courtney Murray's paper because John Courtney Murray had become ill. The paper set out Murray's position that church and state and religious liberty are now necessary. Notice the fluidity of Roman Catholicism. All right. So what can be dogma and heresy, what can be dogmatic and infallibly claimed heresy merely 50 years before religious liberty is now the work of the Holy Spirit. Notice the flip-flop. Notice the ever-changing sands upon which it's built. It remained so during the course of the dispute. Fenton, Murray, and others leading with the promulgation Monsignor Clifford Fenton, was the editor. I'm getting that this is I'm the wrong Fenton here, excuse me. This is a liberal guy, so I read that wrong. This liberal guy, Monsignor Clifford Fenton, is one of the key proponents of Americanism. So he was at this ecumenical meeting with John Courtney Murray, whoever Connell is, and Monsignor Fenton. So they were the leading proponents that Vatican II needed to accept a document called Dignitatis Humanae. The essence of Murray's position was that the state need only base any of its actions on natural law. This was the view that Murray first articulated in this intercreedal discussion. But in that discussion, he at least recognized that there was some preeminence to divine positive law. To Murray, however, the American system of church and state and the American view of religious liberty were thus now completely melding and consistent with natural law, as it ensured societal peace and the acceptance of Catholic doctrine as one of the many, right? So you can, as long as you just have an acceptance of natural law. Now, do you see the problem here with divorcing any area of life from revealed theology, right? What does Losky say? What does Staniloy say? What does Maximus say? For us, nature itself reveals Christ, right? There's no, strictly speaking, natural theology. If you read St. Justin Popovich's famous essay, The Knowledge of God, the whole treatise is an essay against natural theology. We don't do that. Because there's no area of life, there's no reasoning of man that's autonomous or operates on its own without being grounded in its logi or divine revelation. So there's no such thing as natural theology. There's no such thing as natural law that functions apart from Christ or the Trinity. Gunshots going off? Maybe it's fireworks. Anyway. In reality, John Courtney Murray's paper was a refutation of the Catholic doctrine, which Monsignor John Ryan explained 25 years earlier. Right? So Monsignor John Ryan, even 25 years earlier, was noting that religious liberty and the desacralization of the state is heresy. Within 25 years, something goes from being heretical and normatively understood as heretical. And I can give you a whole list of encyclicals prior to the 20th century condemning the idea that the state can be secular and should be separated from the church and its positive divine law. So all Murray did was basically give Americanism and give one little clause about, but there's still divine positive law. Yeah, this is the trick that they always do. All of Vatican II is premised on this ambiguity to read it however you want. However, only a couple decades earlier to this, the Feast of Christ the King had been instituted. Do you know why the Pope, 30 or so years prior to this, instituted the Feast of Christ the King? To combat the idea that the state was secular. You have a whole feast enacted by the Pope, Feast of Christ the King, and I think even the Vatican II people still celebrate this feast. It's like you have a whole council that rejects this. The council says that the Spirit is leading us to accept religious liberty. We even now believe that Hindus love God in their own way. But you still celebrate the Feast of Christ the King, which was instituted to refute the heresy of religious liberty and a secular state. Okay, yeah. Nice try. One of the key institutions that would be created to help promote this and this story is Union Theological Seminary. Who created Union Theological Seminary? The Rockefellers. The Rockefellers created Union Theological Seminary as an engine of American ideology. Henry Luce was a trustee on the Rockefellers' board of Union Theological Seminary. Now he could decide, and they could decide, who would qualify to be a minister in the Protestant world through Union Theological Seminary, Wasp Central, making everybody accept in the Protestant world all this stuff. And guess what? All of the Catholic institutions then accept the higher criticism of all the Wasp crowd, the Wasp higher critical textual studies. So it's the same errors, the same ideology being foisted to do what? Well, if you know about the social gospel, right? Social gospel is, you say, oh, it's Marxist. Well, there's Marxist elements to the social gospel. But the social gospel is actually foisted by people like the Rockefellers intentionally, because there's a whole chapter in the Rockefellers' biography on the social gospel and how they wanted to transform Christianity into an engine that could work with the American ideology. Pragmatism, capitalism, liberalism, they all go together. While at Union Theological Seminary, there were a series of articles written. Murray was presented as defending the Catholic position in exchange of articles with Dean Walter Russell Bowie of Union Theological Seminary when Henry Luce was trustee. It was a staged fight that was designed to advance the American agenda of elevating the American idea of social organization. The context of all these articles was the new Red Scare. Who's behind the Red Scare? A bunch of clowns. American liberals, WASPs, and liberal Jesuits. So guess what? The Red Scare is exaggerated and it's a myth. Now, I'm not saying that there weren't evil Soviets. There are. But what he's beginning to point out is that the first inklings of the coming Cold War gibberish is coming out of these 1949 articles where John Courtney Murray is engaging with leading Protestant scholars. And the Protestant scholars are out of Union Theological Seminary, Time Life magazine, Rockefeller stuff, and they're BFF with John Courtney Murray and the Jesuits. Now, this is going to get even crazier. You think I'm talking about interesting things now? Bro, you don't even know where this is going. We're going to go into straight up tripping acid. Yes, John Courtney Murray will straight up go trip acid. There will be a direct connection between Jesuits and MK Ultra. It's not a lame. There are a lot of TARDSs, a lot of slow boys on the internet who go wild with Jesuit stuff. but it's not all wrong. John Courtney Murray will be intimately connected to CIA. He's one of the first people to trip acid. Did you know that? Is a Jesuit. Yes. Not hippies. Cary Grant, Aldous Huxley, John Courtney Murray, the Jesuit, JFK. They all tripped acid way before any of the dumb hippies did. But nobody knows that. Nobody tells you that. Well, if you'd have read Esoteric Esoteric Harry Wood. That sounds Freudian, doesn't it? If you'd have read Esoteric Hollywood, you would know that, because I talked about it. Anyway, the period of 1950 to 1952 is when this really kicks off, the battle between faithful Catholics, and here we're talking about traditionally minded Catholics, versus Americanists, right? This is the John Courtney Murray Wasp crew. By the way, I mean you're getting some good information here. So if anybody wants to support me with super chats here, I mean, I'm the guy who helps you guys out by reading the 800-page books so that you don't have to, even though I suggest that you do it. But not everybody has time to go and read 800-page books. And we've got almost 400 tonight. So if you would like to ask questions or support with Streamlabs, please do. There's the link to do your super chats via Streamlabs. Anyway, so he goes on to talk about the leading Americanists were Gustav Weigel, the Jesuit, all the writers at America Magazine, and then he lists Spanish Jesuits who saw the Americans were seeking to canonize a political philosophy. Some of the Spanish Jesuits took issue with this. The struggle begins to take place in Catholic journals, American media, and periodicals. The debate becomes whether natural law could function alone as the basis for the state. Now, ultimately what happens is that the proponents of this liberal Jesuit type position end up having to essentially adopt Anglo-American liberalism. And the natural law theory that they promote is the natural law theory of the Enlightenment. He even mentions Christ the King, the feast, whether or not Christ was Lord of the social sphere. Obviously, if you have this autonomous position of natural law and natural law theory, it consistently leads to the position that no, there is an area, namely natural law, that is not necessary to be informed by divine positive law. So, ironically, they're both wrong and they're both right. That's the thing that Wemhoff doesn't get. Because all the French revolutionary people are doing is being consistent with what I just told you a couple nights ago in rejecting the peripatetic axiom. What's the peripatetic axiom of Aristotle and Aquinas? There's nothing in the intellect that's not first in the senses. This is the whole basis of natural law theory, of natural rights, and natural theology, right? And all you have to do is go read David Hume, who says on that basis, you don't actually know causation. You don't actually know teleology. You don't actually know anything metaphysical because none of that is actually in your sense data. It's all interpreted and assumed, right? And so if God is not an object of sense data, then you never know God. So the atheist Enlightenment Humean people are more consistent with the peripatetic axiom than Aquinas and Aristotle are. So here, what I see is two proponents of autonomous man fighting it out. On the one hand, more consistent liberals, Hume and its Enlightenment people, represented by Jesuits and Americanists, and traditional Catholics who are inconsistent in accepting the peripatetic axiom and Thomism, and at the same time trying to defend the fact that the state has to be, quote, Catholic. That's why this is actually a longer debate. Did you know that Bellarmine has a whole treatise too? Bellarmine has a whole argument about political philosophy and religious freedom. Why has this been a debate? because both of these sides are trying to make sense of natural law theory. Guess what? That is the problem. Natural law theory is the issue. McCurry says for $5, WASP. What do you think I mean by WASP? White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, right? The OSS, the CIA were dominated by WASPs. Rockefellers, J.P. Morgan, Carnegie, zillionaire WASP families, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. What do you think their ideology was? Americanism, religious liberty, Protestantism. Not classical Protestantism, not reformed, traditional reformed Christianity, liberalized Protestantism. Social gospel. Thus, it became necessary. This is great. Listen to this. John Courtney Murray was not only able to understand the important aspects of psychological warfare. Catholic professor and scion of a wealthy family, Edward P. Lilly designed and implemented a doctrinal or ideological warfare program. He directed and coordinated his plans to utilize and infiltrate. Did you hear me? John Courtney Murray was not the only one to see the value in using religions. Catholic professor and wealthy family elite magnate Edward P. Lilly designed and implemented the doctrinal ideological warfare program. It'll be C.D. Jackson who implements it, right? So I'm not contradicting myself. I'm just pointing out that the guy who cooked it up was Edward P. Lilly. He said, we can infiltrate Christianity, the various forms, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam, to further the message that America is the good and consistent principle by which all the world should be organized. Even the religions should subordinate to Americanism. In furthering this plan, the government utilized the perennial American approach of emphasizing practicalism, pragmatism, practicality over principle or metaphysic. Catholic priests were thus important assistants now to the U.S. government in making this happen globally. Now let me hear you, trads. Now let's hear the trads bitch about Caesaropapism. Your whole church is a CIA propaganda outlet. Admitted by your own trads. All of this had great significance for Catholicism. The American principles and Enlightenment now inflamed Americanism. Through their efforts of re-engineering societies, primarily by elevating America and Americanism to be the ideal now in the minds of the whole world. Americanism was given a boost now via Catholics in Europe, and that affected prelates who would be present in Rome. Wallace Irvin Jr., an advisor to the Psychological Strategy Board of the U.S. government, was responsible for coordinating psychological operations and doctrinal warfare operations and explained the significant and important aspect of this phenomenon. He wrote, the traditional cultural links of Latin America have been with continental Europe, that is France, Germany, Spain, and Italy. Now, much more than when Paris fell in 1940, the people of Buenos Aires wept in the streets. Thus, in cultural as well as in economic and social factors, a new orientation will be developed. The U.S., Americanism. Right. Now, Latin America is not a primarily European connected entity, becomes an Americanist entity. When European Catholics, especially French, Germans, and Belgians, went Americanist, then the Third World went Americanist. And this was especially true in the case of the Catholic Church. Next, he moves on to talk about other instances of meetings. Now get this. Now we're going to have some of the CIA level stuff step in. 1953 was an important year for Henry Luce and Time magazine. Claire Booth Luce became ambassador to Italy. And this put the Luces in close contact with the Pope the center of the Catholic Church. This also was an important year for the church and state for the issue of religious liberty. Cardinal Ottaviani gave a talk in March in which he stated the Catholic position. This greatly distressed and angered a lot of the proponents of Americanism. In December, Pope Pius XII issued Sche Riesi, which the Americans and Americanists both claim to support. So the Pope tries to have this mediating position, as always, and both sides tried to claim it supported them. So throwing a bone to both sides, the classic papal bureaucratic move. These two talks revealed a dynamic that was already extant in the church. The dynamic was that there was becoming a clear division between liberal Enlightenment ideology in the Catholic Church and the traditional position. John Courtney Murray, he says, was the leading proponent of this Americanist idea. He was accompanied by a fellow Jesuit named Robert Lieber. Lieber was the Pope's confidant and a strong supporter of John Courtney Murray's efforts. This was no surprise, given that Lieber was both a Jesuit and an intelligence asset for America. Lieber had been a source of intelligence during World War II and remains so in the Cold War. To this day, the CIA has not released the records on Jesuit Lieber. Shocker. Now, obviously, this is the case. Jesuit institutions are still connected to the CIA. That's why they promote Americanism. That's why they were behind the whole thing in Ukraine. Duh. Fordham, Jesuit. Fordhamites, Jesuit. CIA, Ukraine. It's not rocket science. CIA and Time magazine then had a cozy ongoing relationship. C.D. Jackson and Klaus Dorn exemplified that relationship. C.D. Jackson had long worked with the U.S. intelligence community at its highest level. Klaus Dorn gathered intelligence on a number of events and maintained contacts with prominent and influential people in Europe. So here you have high-level CIA people directly working with Time magazine and now directly coordinating with the Vatican via Claire Booth Luce as ambassador to Italy. Now we get the thesis of the whole thing. What's the whole plan here? Well, I already said it, but it appears that C.D. Jackson and Klaus Dorn had now gained contacts within the Vatican itself, which provided them with vital information on the personalities, prelates, and events that afflicted the Pope and the Catholic Church's hierarchy. So here's the crux of the whole book right here. Here's the whole thesis. The American proposition, 1953, is the key year where they set this forward. It was in Rome that Henry Luce interjected the American proposition, a doctrinal weapon that he developed along with John Courtney Murray from the Lily dude, right? By which they would inject into the Catholic Church the doctrine of Americanism, into the veins of the Catholic Church. This was done November 29, 1953 in Rome at the Pro Deo University, an institution started by Dominican Felix Morleone, who received backing and support from American elites and the CIA. The Pro Deo institution was thus a CIA front and cutout that taught young Catholics, especially those in business, primarily from Latin countries, that society should be organized along the lines of Americanist principles. Pro Deo thus first taught the Americanist proposition to its students, and they in turn went throughout the world spreading the Americanist ideals. All of this occurred with the approval of the Catholic Church. The American prelates certainly approved of Pro Deo, as did the Dominican order, and Monsignor Giovanni Montini, later known as Paul VI. So much for the trad commie mythology. That just blew the trad communist mythology out of the water. Paul VI, secret communist, the Marxist AA 1025. AA 1025 is low-level, low IQ propaganda concocted by these people. I think Wemhoff even mentions AA 1025. By the way, remember when we did the analysis of Malachi Martin's book? What did we find there? Oh, Malachi Martin just happens to line up in doing the very thing that Wemhoff calls out. Yes, Keys of This Blood just happens to be perfect Cold War propaganda to feed to trads. All right, so he's moving like very slowly in these sections with these different people. Henry Luce had for a long time desired to create something called the World Economic Plan, or WEP. W-A-P, I'm joking. W-E-P. You like my WEP, my World Economic Plan? And basically this was a new way to spread American liberalism to the rest of the world. There is a rot. This is Wemhoff's argument. A rot begins to appear in the church, 1953 to 56. Many supported and approved of Walter Lippmann's public philosophy, which was devoid of any notion of Christ and Christianity, but was assisted by the Rockefeller organization in their efforts at discerning a new national purpose. Most importantly, Lippmann stood with Henry Luce and the Rockefellers in a generic religious movement that would be where they would prop up Charles Wesley Lowery's Frasco, F-R-A-S-C-O. I don't know what Frasco is, but some kind of non-denominational inter-ecumenical thing. Frasco is a willing supporter of the U.S. government's efforts abroad, especially in the ideological area of ideological warfare and co-opting religions. So notice what we see here. Cut out organizations now utilize religions for the ends of the state. What state? The American ideology, the American project, the American century, the American proposition. The reason for this urgency of action now led to other groups. The National Organization for Decent Literature became part of this entity to the promoting of Americanism within the Catholic Church. The urgency of action was needed. Why? Because of communism. The Reds, right? The way to victory and prosperity was a moral way that elevated the faith of America and the American form of government over all others. In other words, if you joined the anti-communist crusade, you could have a good life. If you did not, bad things would happen to you. Luce and Murray organized this as a propaganda psychological warfare outfit. This is a concocted thing. It's not real. It's not true. That doesn't mean that the Soviets and communism are good guys any more than, I don't know, is Saddam Hussein a good guy because we attacked him? No. Saddam Hussein was a CIA asset, trained by the CIA, did black ops for the CIA, installed as a Western puppet, and then they got rid of him. Does that make him a good guy because he's against us and we're the bad? No, of course not. Stop thinking in such simplistic ways. Already by this time, by 1956, Monsignor Fenton found that, or whoever this, I guess he means the same Fenton from before. Fenton found that many of the church's prelates were no longer serious about the belief of the mission of the church herself. Now enters the Rockefellers. The Americanists sense an opportunity, an open window, 1956 to 59. President Eisenhower in 1957 gives his inaugural address. The Americans' experiment has, for generations, fired the passion and courage of millions, seeking freedom, equality, and opportunity. Right? So he reinvigorates this mythology. Like-minded Americans then associated freedom with materialism. The American system of social organization with its economics is now identical to freedom and material prosperity. This was a great work of political psychological warfare. The Rockefellers did their part in devising and advancing an idyllic image of America through the panel work of the Rockefeller Foundation Rockefeller Brothers Fund. Murray made a presentation in which he explained the American consensus at the heart of the American proposition was the liberal tradition of the Enlightenment. This is not that hard. Okay, it's not rocket science that we're doing here. Okay, we can't mix oil and water is the point. Trads, do you hear me? Fenton saw that materialism was gradually strangling the desire for truth and the willingness for those to suffer for truth. The church leadership was ossifying, while the younger Catholics were more tolerant of error. Fenton was not deterred, however, and wrote to define the enemy, therefore hoping to bring them into the fold and better defeat them. Fenton described the view of many Americans, including Americans' founders. The founders were eminently practical men intent on creating a commercial society. They held that every religion was good if they had a standard of conduct that could be conducive to business. Business church. The enemy was liberalism, but unfortunately, Fenton could not bring himself to see that the American idea is liberalism, as John Courtney Murray had openly stated to the Rockefellers. At the height of the Cold War, during 1960 presidential election, while the Catholic Church readied itself for Vatican II, the power trio was threatened with dissolution. That bode ill for Murray, who counted up the Luces so much for his credibility within the church. Who counted on, the Luces for credibility. The Luces in turn held credibility with Catholics, since Clare was now a Catholic married to a Presbyterian and friends with Fulton Sheen. Should that union dissolve, then there would be a problem. Harry, Clare, and John Courtney Murray thus stayed together due to the efforts of Murray and guess what? LSD. Yes, you heard me right. Let me reread that. Luce, Henry, Clare Booth, and John Courtney Murray stayed together in intimate friendships due to the efforts of John Courtney Murray and LSD. The LSD came into their lives through one Gerald Heard, one of the most influential men of the 20th century in terms of culture. Gerald Heard focused modern man on himself and espoused the idea that the businessman is the guru or ultimate authority in modern life. Talk about business, church. All right, this is like Don Draper par excellence, right? He goes off to Esselman, right, at the end of Mad Men. The cultural philosophy was perfect for advancing the American proposition. So here's your lens, trads. Here's who you're having to defend. Jesuits tripping balls with the founder of Time magazine and his so-called Catholic wife. Now, here's where things get more interesting. Unconditional surrender. This is Wemhoff's analysis is that by 1960, the trads had lost. It was over, dude. Give it up. You're not going to reform the Catholic Church because they're going to dogmatize Vatican II. Give it up. The liberals have won. They have now promoted the liberal ideology in the Catholic Church. It's a secular state now. Don't try to bring Catholic monarchies and Christian states into the picture anymore. That will no longer be countenanced. And anybody who's deluded, but John Paul II, Ratzinger, and I think Francis, they have participated in the de-Catholicization of multiple European states. I'm saying literally advising that the state give up its Catholic state status. '60s are crucial because under all of this pressure, money, Wasp Foundation money, constant, boom, 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 media, all this dumb media everywhere, constant. They basically browbeat everybody into accepting, in the 1960s, a pledge. They literally sign a pledge. I'm not joking. Okay, it's an actual thing. You must sign on to this pledge. The surrender came when the Catholic leadership in academia, in the press, theology, business, and civic life signed a statement endorsing the American system of church and state relation. This was accompanied by JFK's speech at Houston and Jesuit Gustav Weigel's speech in 1927, where he let out the paradigm by which Catholic politicians have acted ever since. The new paradigm, according to Weigel, for Catholic politicians would be, in their public life, they would support all kinds of things like abortion, prawn, who knows, whatever else. But in their private lives, they would be Catholic. What was the price of this, supposedly? Now, Wemhoff makes the argument that Catholics wanted a seat at the table, right? This is the Godfather argument, supposedly. Catholics just wanted a seat at the table with the powerful wasps and all this kind of stuff. Really? That's all that it was about? A seat at the table to make money? No, actually, if you read the argumentation of the natural law proponents, they're actually more consistent, because natural law does not dictate that the state has any inherent sacral property. The state has sacral property on the basis of Genesis. And none of these dumb Jesuits believe that Genesis teaches a creation story, do they? No, of course not. They all believe evolution. They've been the greatest evangelizers of evolution for the last century. The only way for the state to be seen as a religious institution fundamentally is if you believe Genesis, that God instituted the state and the death penalty to Noah, and that in continuity with Genesis, the state under Israel is under God. It's a sacral institution. And in continuity with the Byzantine model, the state is under God as a sacral institution. We have never given that up. We will never give up the double-headed eagle. The Catholic position, by accepting natural law theory, letting that continue to erode away during the Reformation, Counter-Reformation, Scholastic, Reformation, Counter-Reformation periods. Once you have the natural law theory coming to preeminence, building your system on natural law, all you got to do is go read David Hume. David Hume's more consistent. So my point is that the Jesuits here they're obviously awful. But if you believe in natural law, why would you not come to their conclusions? If I can interpret the world without revelation, then I can erect a state without revelation. I don't need divine law, positive divine law. But I can't. That's the point. You don't have the ability to properly interpret the fallen world apart from revealed theology. And that doesn't just apply to studying nature. It applies to the role of church and state. Revelation dictates the relationship of church and state. And millennia of Christianity have already determined the relation of church and state, namely coronation ceremonies. So all of this and this nonsense of Jesuit Americanism, it represents a forfeiting of the Orthodox traditional Christian position. So that's how I'm saying, in one sense, the trads here are right, but in another sense, they're also wrong. And the Jesuits are right, because they're trying to argue everything on the same liberal grounds, natural theology. So it's just two idiot positions based on older liberalism arguing it out. And I'm saying, yes, Enlightenment liberalism comes from the peripatetic axiom. Whatever is not in the senses is not in the intellect. Anything in the intellect must first be in the senses. That's the whole Thomistic system is built on that. And Rome adopted wholesale as its official philosophy, the Thomistic system. I don't mean wholesale as if they believe everything Thomas believed. I know that they don't believe everything Thomas believed. But the philosophy is classical foundationalism, which is based on the peripatetic axiom. There's no disputing that. It's not in debate. Now, FDR. Who does FDR serve? as he's promoting all this jibber jabber. He is a banking asset. There's no debate about that. Go read the chapter in Quigley about FDR, and Quigley explains how the whole FDR thing was just a decade-long plus scam to centralize the wealth for a while through the socialism projects, then shift the country back over to privatization, let the wealth build, then shift all that wealth over to a socializing system. And Quigley says that all of the debt that was racked up under the FDR socialization projects was all owed to the international bankers. So it was a huge scam, according to Quigley, from the CFR archives, not according to conspiracy theorists, according to Quigley. CIA operative and Time magazine employee Klaus Dorn had stated that an entire revolution had now occurred by Vatican II in the Catholic Church. CIA operative Klaus Dorn, Time magazine employee Klaus Dorn, wrote, a virtual revolution had now occurred in the Catholic Church at the beginning of Vatican II. They knew what they were doing. Paul Blanchard observed that Vatican II was now the opportunity for the American ideology to re-engineer societies. I've read Paul Blanchard's whole analysis of Vatican II. That's exactly correct. Second Vatican Council provided an opportunity for Americanism to be harnessed, for the Catholic Church to be an engine for Americanism, and for the world dominion which FDR had announced in modern times with his For Freedom speech. Now he had the perfect laboratory for creating this engine, Vatican II. And what would this be a revolution for? A revolution for, quote, freedom. As the council started, a media barrage would attack and follow every session of Vatican II. This is Paul Blanchard commenting on it. This was all by design. This did not slow down with the American media, especially Henry Luce in Time magazine, who used every bit of print at his disposal to influence, to write, and promote the Americanist idea of Vatican II. He was involved in efforts to keep a number of the dissident theologians in place. So even though some trads tried to ban Hans Küng and John Courtney Murray from speaking at Catholic universities and the Catholic University of America, Henry Luce put every bit of influence and power behind them coming to speak. Thus, Time magazine continued to depict the Catholic Church as an undergoing process institution, a perpetual revolution institution. Even after John the 23rd had died, John the 23rd was praised as a revolutionary. Cardinal Ottaviani and all those who stood by him were condemned as reactionaries in Time magazine. So here's Henry Luce, Time magazine, saying John the 23rd was great because of his liberalism. He initiated this great council. Cardinal Ottaviani is a reactionary and a dry old rigorist who deserves to be condemned. Paul VI, however, was generally viewed as positive by the Americanists, and he succeeded John the 23rd. But in time, however, Americans somewhat grew disenchanted with even Paul VI. He wasn't liberal enough. So eventually, however, the Americanists gained ground at the council. Their successors were not in the doctrinal area, but in the presentation, their successes, were not necessarily doctrinal, but in how the documents and dogmas were presented. This was the pastoral arena. Monsignor Fenton captures the dynamic of Americanism at the council. The statement of the council is not necessarily a theological textbook. Oh, really? At the same time, however, a declaration by a council can cause confusion, or finally, it can actually be harmful, even though there's no error in the faith or in the morals of the documents themselves. However, the statement passes over truths which are and which have long been generally recognized as Catholic doctrine. So here's Monsignor Fenton admitting that the council is not stating things the way that Catholic dogma had always stated it. Yeah, because it's heretical, obviously. How can it be the case that a secular state is apostasy 25 years before Vatican II in the 50s into the 60s? And then in the time of the 60s, suddenly now religious liberty is what the Holy Spirit wants. So the Holy Spirit just changes his mind over time. But yes, if you're a Roman Catholic, there's countless examples where the Holy Spirit apparently just directs the Pope to change his mind, reverse the decisions of his predecessors. No problem in terms of moving the goalposts. They're experts at that. At Vatican II, it is in fact the U.S. bishops who most strongly push the Declaration of Religious Liberty. Oh, shocker there, right? And you can imagine who all the obvious players are. It's all the people we've heard of, all the famous periti of Vatican II. Now they start to speak of a spirit of Vatican II. The spirit of Vatican II is usually at this point, 1964, identified with religious liberty. The Americans made their play for religious liberty in the third session of the council. John Courtney Murray laid out the plan, wrote in Time magazine, and was promoted by, in America, Cardinal Cushing. Get this. During the third session, the famous phrase, Spirit of Vatican II, was coined in the pages of Time magazine. This phrase represents the efforts to remake the church in the image of America. This is akin to the spirit of 1776. Literally, the Spirit of Vatican II is identified as the Spirit of 1776. It was time then for the church to catch up to the modern world and the principles of 1776. Anyone at this time, here's the trick, by the way. Anyone at this time, he notes, who would begin to criticize Americanism was labeled by the press as a communist sympathizer. Imagine that. You could be a monarchist criticizing this nonsense, and they're going to call you a commie. I mean, people say this to me. Idiot trads online call me KGB. As a monarchist? What are you talking about? That makes no sense. But they're just reacting under the old school low IQ propaganda that their masters put into place at the time of Vatican II, which was that anyone who questioned Vatican II must be a commune. Why? Because Vatican II is promoting the spirit of 1776, obviously. And who would be against 1776 but an evil commie? You're either with us or you're with the terrorists. You're either with us or you're with the terrorists. Imagine just the stupidity of this. I mean, the level of understanding this is literally the same as the level of thinking that you're either with us or with the terrorists. I mean, this is who runs the country, people like this, right, at the political level. Eventually, radicals came on board amongst the cardinals, like Cardinal Bay, a ferocious proponent of capitalism and its corollary, ecumenism. Yes, ecumenism is capitalism in the religious sphere. Let's just shop amongst the ideologies for the ones that you like. Over time, more and more of the so-called prelates caved in. Archbishop Kroll of Philadelphia made clear in interviews given to the Camden Star-Herald that he was now prepared to accept it. The Declaration on Religious Liberty, Dignitatis Humanae, it was supposedly not a change in doctrine, even though 50 years prior it was called apostasy and heresy. It had been misinterpreted You just have to interpret it in the right way. Right. So this fallback coping mechanism that the trads all want to use, oh, it's just a misinterpretation. Yeah, right. Anybody that would go against this, American proponents and techniques of psychological warfare had already determined that anyone who questioned it could be castigated as a communist sympathizer. Even if they were monarchist or episcopate, or members of the episcopate, they would be called red sympathizers for questioning Vatican II. This leads at a certain point to chaos, even within the council. There was a period of chaos. C.D. Jackson himself observed that the use of epidictic language, apodictic, I guess, from Aristotle, language in the council documents coupled the fuel to the rise of a spirit of rebellion, which is the spirit of 1776, which is the spirit of Vatican II. So C.D. Jackson explicitly says, yes, our intention in this was to equate the spirit of Vatican II with the spirit of American liberalism. Yes, it's not rocket science we're doing here. It's not that hard to figure out. Then he goes on to say, after Vatican II, the aftermath was that the church descended to anarchy with the close of the council. Well, that's not a true council then, even on Roman Catholic grounds, David. I mean, Mr. Wemhoff here, how can a dogmatic council cause the church to be in anarchy? What does the Auctorum Fidei condemnation of the Jansenists say? The Roman See cannot give a bad rite or discipline to the church. How much more can she not give a false counsel or teaching to the church? To say that Vatican II is a ecumenical council that causes the church to go into anarchy is to deny Vatican I. You're denying the universal, ordinary magisterial teaching of the church according to Vatican I by saying that an ecumenical council can lead the church into chaos and anarchy. That's literally condemned. So, give up Roman Catholicism, or say that Vatican II didn't lead the church into chaos and anarchy. I mean, I don't know how. There's no way out of this problem. It's because it's not true. Now we get the worship of freedom. Okay, the aftermath of Vatican II is completely devastating. And within 4 years of the council, all of the main players and movers and these CIA operatives and Jesuits, they're all dead. Gustav Weigel, C.D. Jackson, Henry Luce, Francis Connell, John Courtney Murray, Colonel Spellman, Monsignor Fenton, they're all dead. So the architects of this nonsense, they all die. Now we get 60s counterculture. And if you've read Dave McGowan, if you listen to the stuff we've talked about for the last freaking 10 years on my website, then you know that the 60s counterculture was also CIA. Do you see that it's not accidental? The 60s counterculture with the CIA promoting LSD and all the Laurel Canyon stupid bands, right? It's not accidental that the same CIA is giving LSD to John Courtney Murray and promoting 1776 at Vatican II. The CIA is doing both things. And they're connected. If they got the Catholic Church to accept the principles of Americanism and were given the leading Jesuits acid, making them trip balls, then yes, they had taken over. The institution is forfeited. And you say, well, but they didn't take over Rome. Yes, they did. They took over Rome because Rome confirmed all this. Okay, this is not, you can't get around this, oh, this is all happening in America. It ain't happening in Rome. No, Rome confirms the Americanism at Vatican II. That's the point. All this coping doesn't work. So now he's going to talk about, how long have I been going here? Oh, we've only been going an hour. Okay, so we're doing good. Still got almost 400. And Skull and Bones, Henry Luce, Wasp, Skull and Bones. Henry worked with Walter Lippmann, as we said, of the OSS. Skull and Bones as a OSS Wasp entity created originally in this time period, the 40s, would identify American gentry. So what it is to be an American gentleman, the gentry of America, that equals the Christian capitalist, right? So the wealthy elite WASP capitalist is identical to what it is to be a Christian gentleman. Now, what happened was that a lot of the immigrants, Catholic immigrants, right, they're still, I'm not saying there were no wealthy Catholics, there were some, but the leading institutions, given that America was primarily a Protestant colony, primarily founded by Protestants for the most part, the old East Coast establishment people at Yale, etc., Princeton, all of these people, and especially Yale, because Skull and Bones comes from Yale, and the OSS and the CIA come out of Skull and Bones and Yale. Literally. Okay, so if you don't know that, you're not going to understand the ideological dynamic, the power dynamic behind what's motivating people to take over for example, the OSS. One thing that they do is take over the old French drug networks. So the French intelligence prior to the OSS, they ran and controlled a lot of the drug alleyways. This is for black markets. Okay, this is not conspiracy theory. This is basic intelligence history. While the OSS ended up taking over those drug routes. This is how a lot of these old families got to be rich and famous. Was drugs. Did you know that? A lot of the Eastern Seaboard elite didn't just sell pelts. They didn't just sell cheese. They sold drugs, opium. That's how they got rich. The Eastern Seaboard elite made their money on drugs. This is called the Wasp Elite. He has a whole chapter on it. To realize this dream of creating an Americanist world, and he even talks about Skull and Bones and the false flag of the Lusitania, which was a false flag. He says that to realize this dream, they needed money, workers, and a winning idea. There was $100,000 in seed money back in, this is a long time ago, 1918. This is early people at Yale. A number of prominent Protestants, namely Theodore Roosevelt Jr., Henry Van Dyke, diplomat, Presbyterian minister, president of Yale, Princeton, the president of Johns Hopkins, Columbia College, all put their money into a project, right? And this project would become Time Magazine. Thus, Time Magazine drew upon Wasp Elite from its founding to rise to prominence. The staff and writers, however, were not just drawn from Yale, but also from Harvard, Princeton, Oxford, and Columbia. Eastern Seaboard Elite directly connected to British intelligence. You see here. Now, who comes over to tell the Eastern Seaboard Elite how to set up an intelligence agency? British intelligence. William Stevenson, codename Intrepid. Bill Donovan, Ian Fleming. Have you ever heard of them? Yeah, that's who helped set up the OSS. Why? Because these Eastern Seaboard Elite families were directly connected to British intelligence, to Oxford, and to the Anglo elite. And that's all covered in this, right? So then he goes back to Lippmann. Now, what does Walter Lippmann do in this for everybody? Well, Walter Lippmann comes into play because in 1914, Walter Lippmann became the editor of the New Republic. When World War I broke out, Lippmann saw it as an opportunity to advance democracy. Lippmann then began to draft the propaganda for the Allies during World War I. He thus assisted Woodrow Wilson in drawing up the 14 points. Who did Woodrow Wilson work for? The bankers. Read Colonel House, Colonel Edwin Mandell House, Woodrow Wilson, agent of the banking elite. At the same time, the budding science of Watsonian behaviorism provided Walter Lippmann with the principles to control and manipulate society. Now we enter the pre-Bernays stuff. Okay, this gets into Bernays. Manipulating public opinion. This is when Lippmann writes his landmark book, Public Opinion, in 1922. Lippmann claimed that psychologists had discovered the conditioned response, behavior response, stimulus response. Emotion is not attached to any idea per se. So now, in other words, man will just be treated as a beast that can be controlled by stimulus response. Enter in Skinner, B.F. Skinner, and the research of Pavlov. All of these guys' research is being used by these people. Stimulus response, stimulus response. Now enters in psychoanalysis and Freud. The utilization of sexual imagery in advertising. The utilization of stimulus response to manipulate emotions. The utilization of Freudian psychoanalysis. All of this begins to be utilized at the behest, not just of psychological warfare for military purposes, but application to the domestic population through admin, through TV, through mass media. Thus, we see Freudian principles. We see all of these degenerate, Skinnerian, Pavlovian, behaviorist, Watsonian principles adopted. And the idea is utilize these tricks to sell people on the new American ideology. We can thus utilize all these psyops tricks to debase the people, to control their perception. Now we can reorient their whole perception of life, of the world, of religion, the church, America, Americanism. In other words, they had mastered social engineering by this time. Culture creation, creating toxic culture. Thus, by the time that he had set up Time Magazine and got it going, and by the time it became like the preeminent tool of telling America what America is and how to believe and how to think, Time Magazine basically became an empire which was able to control perception through the control of information. This allows later on other entities to rise to power, like the Rand Corporation, other think tanks and NGOs, which are also able to now contribute to the steering of the American ideology, redefining America as the Rand Corporation does, from being a production economy to a service economy, from creating a production-based economy to a coomer culture. Consumer. All created by Rand Corporation, even to the extent of how to convince people that they are atomistic individuals. And as an atomistic individual, their life could be fulfilled by instantaneous pleasure principle, being satiated through consumerism. It's all BS, and it's all a trick. All of it. What does Alex Abea? Remember we covered Alex Abea's Soldiers of Reason? History of the Rand Corporation? He says, if you reject or disagree with any of Americanism, then you reject and disagree with the Rand Corporation, because the Rand Corporation is who created modern America. So you've been sold bullshit. It's not true. It's a lie. It's all based on pragmatism, atheism, liberalism, Skinnerianism, Pavlovianism, Watsonianism, materialism, and it's all a lie. And they even say it doesn't matter if it's true or false because it's used to control you. That's what the architects of this bullshit say. Do you understand that? The new gospel, the new ideology would be the, quote, great liberal tradition. This was something that Henry Luce made up. Henry Luce said we got to give an embodiment to a tradition so that America can accept what America is, to redefine America. Not that it wasn't already liberal, but to redefine it in such a way that it could be used as an engine of the Wasp, Skull and Bones establishment. What does he come up with? The liberal tradition. What is this? Let's let Henry Luce himself explain what this is. Luce said, America is the supreme embodiment of the tradition. Garibaldi wrote that Abraham Lincoln spoke of our country as the apostle of liberty, the harbinger of progress. Note the religious language, the apostle of liberty. This is Luce. Still, America is the great magnetic hope and example for the world. It will draw to herself all who wish to make Europe at last beautiful and free. The last great effort being made to establish the liberal tradition, that is, political freedom, equality, justice, freedom of thought, freedom of opinion, common decency, the rights of men and women, common decency, the rights of men and men. It is a very close battle. The odds are, as far as we can see, about 50-50. So he's saying this, I guess, right before like World War II, right? So basically it's just saying that America is the only hope for the world. The American mythos is French Revolutionary Enlightenment BS. Generic things, freedom of ideas, freedom of political freedom, freedom of ideas, equal justice, freedom of opinion, common decency. What are you talking about? Right. But again, remember from the propaganda standpoint, one of the basic rules of propaganda is use the generic, most generic possible slogans, because that allows everybody to interpret the slogans any way they want, right? You don't want to use a lot of high level precision in your propaganda. Just keep it dumb, dude, because the more generic and catchy it is, the easier it is to bring people in because they can read into it whatever they want, right? Just think of the social justice type things, right? Same principle here. All the social justice stuff is the latest incarnation of this stuff. Luce believed that the United States Constitution is the liberal tradition. As a corollary of his belief in the Constitution, Henry Luce believed that business is essentially civilization. Business is life. Yes, you heard me. Business church. You think I'm joking when I talk about business church. I'm not joking when I talk about business. I'm saying that the real church is business, is mammon. So here, through media, is one of the most powerful men in the world at this time. The voice of Skull and Bones, the voice of the OSS, the projector of the four freedoms to the world, essentially saying that Leo the 13th, in his encyclical condemning the Enlightenment principles, has to go away. The new freedoms that must be accepted, guess what? They're the freedoms: liberty, equality, fraternity, social justice. Where have we heard that before? Oh, that's the Masonic freedoms. And if he's in Skull and Bones, what is Skull and Bones? Oh, that's Lodge 322. Lodge 322 is the Germanic order of Skull and Bones. The Lodge of Skull and Bones originates there, which is teaching the four freedoms of Freemasonry, condemned by Pope Leo XIII. So notice, American Enlightenment Freemasonry embodied in the Skull and Bones dictum. The four freedoms. Henry Luce is OSS. OSS is Skull and Bones. Henry Luce is Skull and Bones. Skull and Bones is Lodge 322. That's Masonic. It's not rocket science we're doing here. It's not that hard to figure out. Next, we have to talk about, we're at 2 hours, but next we have to talk about Halford Mackinder, the Heartland Theory, the classic geopolitical analysis, the Milner Group, Rhodes, Rothschild, Milner, the Society of the Elect. That's the secret society that was set up to create the Anglo-American Empire establishment. We will go into his chapter on this, but basically this is just a chapter summarizing what you heard me do all my lectures on. If you've not heard the Quigley, Tragedy and Hope, and Anglo-American Establishment lectures, go listen to those. Subscribe at my site to hear all those. But that will be where he goes next. And he will talk about the birth of the Anglo-American project prior to World War I with Rothschild, Rhodes, Milner, the roundtable groups. This will be the plan, not just for the waning British Imperium, but the Pax Americana to take over, to be the engine of the Anglo-American establishment. And yes, the State of Israel will play a role in that, obviously. But remember, the British Empire was already a world power prior to the establishment of the State of Israel. Yes, I know about the Balfour Declaration. I know about Sykes-Picot Treaty. I know about all that stuff. We'll get to that. But suffice to say that for part one, we will end it there because we've covered a lot of meat here. But I hope you get the point here. The point of what we're saying with this is that it's not as simple as saying that, like, the Vatican was subverted by Freemasons. John Venari's Alta Vendita document shows that the Alta Vendita Lodge took over the papacy. It's more than that, okay? There's power players like the Anglo-American establishment, the CIA, who co-opt openly the Roman Catholic Church. We don't have to resort to obscure Masonic conspiracies. We already know what happened, okay? And it's clear in this book. So we're going to do this book next. We're gonna work our way through all of it. Please, if you do want to get into it, I recommend the book. I know not everybody has time to read an 800-page book, but definitely it's 800 pages, 1,000+ footnotes. We're going to be getting into the CFR. We're going to be getting into Cold War. We're going to be getting into Russia. We're going to be getting into Radio Liberty, how that's a CIA operation during the Cold War, how it's related to the Catholic Church, spies in high places. We're going to get in, I mean, this book is wild. We're going to get into Hollywood. There's a whole section in this book on Hollywood. So it's bigger than we oftentimes assume. And it does, the convenient narrative of one bad guy is not true. And the trads are just going to have to come to grips with that. Or they can just continue melting away in their collapsing entity known as the Roman Catholic Church, if they choose to, if that's what they want to do. So I said that we would do also Q&A. So I'm in a good mood and I'm enjoying talking about this material. And if anybody wants to hop on in the Discord, feel free to. You can go into the Discord and ask questions about the material that we covered today, theological questions. I don't care what you want to talk about. If you get too ridiculous, I'll just kick you out. So don't waste my time or anybody's time with stupid stuff. So let me pull up the Discord here as I answer the Super Chats. So we got a few Super Chats here. Thank you guys for those Super Chats. So M. Curry, we explained what Wasp was. Ross, thank you for that $20. Nice $20 from old Ross there. I don't know who Ross is, but thank you, Ross. Is that Ross from Friends? Thank you, Ross from Friends. A, $10. Thank you, A. Let's get $10 from every letter in the alphabet, and then we'll be set for this week. Can pay all the bills. Schopenhauer's Bunny. I like that. Schopenhauer's Bunny. I don't have a question. I just wanted to support you. Hey, dude. Much appreciated. Thank you for that. Taco, $3. Great information, but do impressions more often. Now, we typically kind of divide the streams up, like, well, we're going to be doing a Soprano stream pretty soon. So that will be rife with impressions. I'm going to try to impersonate everybody. I've got Paulie good. I've got Tony good. I've got Christopher pretty good. I guess that's like the main ones, but yeah. So we'll have a lot of fun with that Sopranos analysis because that was a great show. It was one of my favorite shows. I loved it. I was happy with the ending. I thought it ended really cool. Anyway, so when we do that, or when we do the more jokey streams, there's a lot more impressions in those. So, but thank you for that $3 taco. Jack for $3 says, "What is the purpose of riots and violence?" This is a strategy of controlled chaos. So if you read, there's a great essay at Global Research by Andrew Marshall, young guy around my age. But he wrote a book, or a long essay called Arc of Crisis, and it's about Brzezinski's model of controlled chaos. So if you want to understand the purpose of riots and violence, go read Andrew Marshall's essay, Arc of Crisis, about Brzezinski. But essentially it just serves to propel thesis, antithesis, synthesis, right? Doorman 360, you may be right about the subversion of the Latins, but you're too mean to debate. Yeah, sure. Okay. Well, thank you, Doorman 360. I'll take that I'm too mean. Yeah, whatever. Hey, we just had trads all day hanging out in my Discord. Nobody got mad. It was perfectly civil. We talked for 3 hours to at least 2 or 3 different trads. So it's not the case that everybody that I'm mean to everybody, all this kind of nonsense. And imagine the people who are we're the Church of the Crusaders, we're the Crusading Knights, and then you turn around and you're butthurt because supposedly I'm mean. I thought you were a Crusader, bro. I thought you were a Crusader. You're LARPing as a knight, but you're mad because I'm mean. All right, so there's the super chats. We got 400 people. Welcome everybody. Thank you for those, and feel free to you're gonna like the Pauly impression. It's gonna be on point, but we'll save that for the Soprano stream that Jamie and I will do. So come to the general chat in the Discord if you want to. Let me add the Discord here. We'll probably get an influx of lunatics. Not everybody. I love you guys. You're not all lunatics, but I'm sure some of you guys are lunatics. So we'll have to vet the lunatics out of here. So let me get the Discord link ready. And then I'll open up Discord here and we can do Q&A. All right, Greedo, are you there?
Yes, I am.
We've got Greedo. He's our good friend from Australia.
I'm here to ask questions and get them to you, yeah?
He's here. He's here to do his best Mel Gibson impression. He's doing Mel Gibson impersonating Greedo.
If I do a Mel Gibson impersonation, they'll shut down the Discord and ban you from YouTube.
Okay. Well, in that case, is there anybody who wants to do Q&A? If not, we don't have to. But if there is there anybody?
I kind of have a few questions.
Okay.
Should I ask them? Or what?
Yes, you can ask them next.
Okay, Jay, Recently, you were talking about natural law and like something, and
Right.
not really too familiar with the issue. If you could just explain quickly what's wrong exactly with natural law and what your the Orthodox position is, that'd be dandy.
All right, so the easiest, best explanation for this is I'm going to tell you now I've got it linked at my website. There's one chapter. It's an essay called Knowledge. It's called the Theory of Knowledge of Saint Isaac the Syrian. Okay, and this is an essay that is in this excellent book. I recommend the whole book, Orthodox Faith and Life in Christ by Saint Justin Popovich, because he not only does he critique the papacy and the humanism of the papacy, but he has a whole chapter called The Theory of Knowledge of Isaac the Syrian. And Isaac the Syrian, who is obviously a saint in the Orthodox Church, has the same epistemology as Saint Maximus. So the doctrine is based on the doctrine of the Logi. And so what he's going to do in this chapter is talk about how, as Orthodox, we don't have the Thomistic doctrine of natural theology, because Maximus doesn't teach natural theology. So what we're saying here is not that there's no such thing as nature. It's not that nature doesn't teach us God. It's that nature doesn't teach us generic theism. Nature teaches us Christ. And no one who believes in natural theology believes that nature teaches Jesus, because Jesus, the Trinity, all that stuff in Thomism is an afterthought. That's something that you prove after you've proven and stacked up this stuff of natural theology. So what is natural theology? Natural theology is autonomous man reasoning in a sphere apart from revelation, according to Fides et Ratio of John Paul II. It's not based on revelation. It makes no reference to revealed theology. It's man reasoning only from created mental principles about the world. So we're going to reason about the external world, causation, telos, purpose, the beginning of the world, etc., how it came to be, and it's all a bunch of nonsense. Why? Because it starts with the peripatetic axiom that nothing is in the intellect that's not first in the senses. Okay? That's not no one can defend that position anymore, because at the time of the Enlightenment it gets critiqued into devastation. It gets destroyed. Now, how can I prove all this? Very easily. Can you interpret the world as it is right now without making reference to the fall? Now, if you believe in natural theology, yes, you can derive all these principles about the operation of the natural world merely by sense data without any reference to revelation. So, but wait a minute. When I do that and I look out at the world, I notice there's things like death and decay, predator and prey. Is the predator-prey/death feature of the world natural? Now, most Thomists are probably going to say something like, yes, there's a natural process that occurs in relationship to death now. Well, wait a minute. Paul says death is the enemy. Death entered because of the fall. So you can't interpret the world as it is right now without the doctrine of revelation, namely that it was created, and that the reason that the world is in the state that it is right now is because of the fall. So the predator-prey death aspect of the world is not natural. Thus, St. Maximus can say, grace and virtue are the most natural things to man. There's nothing more natural to man than grace. So we don't have this nature-grace dichotomy that they have. We don't have this natural theology, revealed theology type of system. The natural world is the same content as revealed theology. It's just two different modes. So what's the meaning of Scripture? The Logi of Christ. What's the meaning of the natural world? The Logi of Christ. How do they differ? It's two different modes or mediums or methods. So the Bible is a bunch of written texts about Jesus, ultimately. The natural world is a bunch of animals and sticks and birds and stones about Jesus. That's what Maximus teaches. That's the whole point of the Logi doctrine. That's the whole point of this chapter about the Logi doctrine. that it's not natural theology from Thomism. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think I got a little bit of that.
So the very first chapter of Experience of God by Staniloy, he starts his systematic theology with this, what I'm saying. For the Orthodox, there is no distinction between supernatural grace and nature per se. There is a distinction, but not a distinction the way that the Roman Catholics say it. We don't believe in natural theology. He says it's more appropriate to call what we believe in natural revelation. And he says, how is that the case? Where does he go to first? Maximus. The first thing he appeals to is Maximus and the Logi. Because nature is not an uninterpreted brute fact that comes to you without any theory. Nature is what the Logos created it to be. Therefore, it can only be interpreted and understood according to its Logi in Christ. So it's impossible to believe in natural theology. Hence why Staniloy correctly calls it natural revelation. I mean, another way I can prove this is that if you believe in natural theology, then you literally believe that in Romans 1, when Paul talks about the knowledge of God that all men possess, they literally exegete that as Aristotelian syllogisms. No, Paul is not talking about Aristotelian syllogisms in Romans 1. He's talking about the nous, the heart of man, is guilty because all men know in their hearts that there's one true God. It has nothing to do with Aristotle's syllogisms. And so the whole Thomistic exegesis of what Romans 1 is talking about is absurd.
Thank you. That was
Jay, sorry, I was going to make up a question. How do we define, all Hart was going to say, how do we define God's omnipotence in orthodoxy so that the ability to cause divine persons is thus not held by all the members of the Trinity?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, so somebody might say, sometimes Thomists say this, they say, I've even heard Muslims make this argument. They'll say that every person in the Trinity has to have everything in common, or one of them would lack. So, for example, if we say that the Father alone is the cause of the Godhead, then somehow the Son and the Spirit would be subordinated because they lack the power of causing. Well, the first thing that we would say is that if you read the Cappadocians, the power of causing is not it's what we call a hypostatic property. So it's not a natural property. So anything that we're going to say is a power common to the persons is an attribute or a power that's proper to the divine nature. So the power to create the world, the power to show divine justice, divine mercy, divine love, those are all common to the Godhead, and so they're therefore properties or attributes that are natural to God. But hypostatic properties are different because they're the only properties that we believe as Orthodox from the Cappadocians that distinguish the persons. So what is the Father's unique hypostatic property that makes him alone who he is, such that it can't be attributed to any other person? For us, it's cause. That is the Father's unique property. So the words that the Church Fathers use to describe the person of the Father that's confirmed at the First Ecumenical Council in the Cappadocian and Athanasian theology is arche, anarche, fount of Godhead, unoriginate origin, cause. I think that's most of them, right? So those basically sum up who the Father is, and they're all describing the same single hypostatic reality. They're not different attributes of his person. That is his hypostatic reality. The Father is the sole origin, the sole cause, the sole monarchia, the sole arche, the sole anarchia, right? All of those properties, he's autotheos. He alone is autotheos, okay? Self-caused, self-existent. Because the Son and the Spirit derive their hypostatic existence from the Father. That's why Nicaea, the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed, is Cappadocian in stating the God from God, light from light proposition. That's what all the Cappadocians taught about the monarchia of the Father. So to be cause, to be arche, to be fount, to be origin, to be beginning, to be source, to be autotheos, self-caused, those are all names expressing the same reality that is the Father. Those are all describing who he is. So he cannot share that with anyone else because they would be Father, right? So the Son can't share any of those properties because now you have a Father-Son. Now you have a dyad. So the power, so-called, of being the fount, arche, monarchia, etc., is the Father's hypostatic property. It's not a property of the Godhead by which one of the other persons lacks. Because the Son, by sharing in the divine nature, has all the same powers that the Father has. He's co-eternal. He's co-equal. He has co-dignity, right? He has co-reign. He has co-love. You could say all of the attributes that are common to the Godhead are shared by the Son and the Spirit equally. But as it comes to origin and order, no. The Father is the first. The Father is the fount. The Father is God. When we say God, we mean the person of the Father.
That's a good answer. Does anyone else have a question?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
Are the persons of the Trinity God in and of themselves, or are they God only in relation to the Father?
Yes, all the Cappadocians are absolutely unanimous that the only person who's autotheos is the Father. So the Son and the Spirit, when they're called co-unoriginate, that's in reference to creation. It's when they're contrasted to creatures that the Son is called co-unoriginate. He is not called co-unoriginate in respect to the Trinity proper. He's always called of the Father. And you can read the orations. Gregory Nazianzus is super emphatic about this. He's very clear. Basil is very emphatic about this. To be unoriginate, to be the unoriginate origin, to be autotheos is to be the Father. So the only sense, basically, that I am aware of in which we can say the Son has the power of being eternal co-originate, right? Or, co-unoriginate, is in reference to creatures, because the Trinity created the world. Father, Son, and Spirit all participate in the action of creating the world. So there is a couple places where Nazianzus will say, is he co-unoriginate? He says only in contrast to creatures. But in terms of the Trinity proper, he is not co-unoriginate, because that would mean he shares the Father's unique property of being the unoriginate origin.
Okay.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
So, Jay, you said that when referring to God, we are referring to the Father.
Correct.
So then how come it is also correct to say that Jesus is God, though, if God is only referring to the Father?
No, I said, properly speaking, God refers to the Father. But God
Okay.
also refers to the Son and the Spirit, because the Father communicates the same divine nature to the Son and to the Spirit. So if you read the Creed, what does the Creed say? We believe in one God, the Father Almighty. So the Cappadocians will stress that the beginning of the Godhead and the recapitulation of Godhead relates back to the person of the Father. So the Father not only is the origin, he's also the source of unity. How is he the source of unity? Because he communicates that single divine nature to the other two.
I see.
So we're not saying that the Trinity isn't God. We're saying that most of the time when we see the phrase, we believe in one God, it's referring to the hypostasis of the Father. And we say that because it guards the primacy of the person, of personhood. We don't begin our Trinitarian theology with the essence.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. I would recommend Dr. Bo's talk on the Monarchia. He's very good on that. And he just restates what the Cappadocians say.
Okay.
I
Christian
have a
D.
question.
I'll just read this one and then we'll get to you. Christian D asks, what do you think of the major milestones in the global reaction to the Roman Catholics / CIA takeover?
What do I think of the major milestones in what? Say that again?
Yeah. What do you think of the major milestones in the global reaction to the RCC / CIA takeover?
I think the milestones in reaction would be what we've seen in the last several years in relation to the back and forth between the West and Russia. That's the main milestones of reaction. So the expansion of Orthodox Christianity in Russia, the situation in the Ukraine, Montenegro, the church overthrowing what happened in Montenegro. Those are the major milestones of reaction.
Okay, so to the questioner, go ahead. You there?
This is a two-parter, so I'm going to ask kind of like two questions related to Protestantism.
Okay.
So yeah, my first question is, how do you respond to the Protestant notion that the church is invisible as opposed to the Orthodox view of a church that is a visible institution?
I would simply say that Paul's predominant image of the church is the body. The body of Christ is just as physical and just as flesh as our bodies. When Christ was resurrected, he told Thomas to put your finger in my side to show to Thomas that Jesus wasn't a phantasm. It was the same Jesus who went to the cross, right? So he has the same body. He has the same piercing in his side. And he says, put your finger in my side to show that it's a physical body. It's the same one. So in the same way, the Eucharist is physical, actual bread, actual wine, because that's how Jesus instituted it. And so in the same way, the church is made up of visible, physical bodies of people. So it makes no sense to have this Platonic ideal invisible church, because that no longer fulfills the promises in the Old Testament about what the church would be when it comes to be, right? You have all these prophecies in the Old Testament that the sign of the coming of the Messianic age will be when all of the Gentile nations start to pour into the church. When I go to church history, I can look and see who that church is. It's the Orthodox Church. That's the church of the first 1,000 years.
Okay, so in the second part to that was just a little context. Me and a friend of mine were talking to a Protestant, older guy, and we wanted to know, how do you respond to Protestants downplaying the importance of the way communion is prepared? And to give a little understanding as to why we're asking is because the guy that we're talking to said that we needed to, that if it was like, I guess you could say, if it was proper and there's an actual meaning to it, then it should be done in a feast, because it was originally prepared on a table in a feast form. So how would you respond to that?
I think what you're saying. So, right, we wouldn't say that. So when Jesus was instituting this feast in the upper room and setting the pattern for it, he's doing a lot of things that are in accordance with multiple rituals from the Jewish service, right? So it's not just Passover. It's partly Passover, but it's also related to other feasts by which the Jews, if you read Deuteronomy, a lot of times when they would have the feast, they would come to the temple. They would bring their sacrifice, and they would actually eat the animal with the priest in the sacrifice. So there's a communal covenantal meal. When Moses goes up on the mountain in Exodus, he has a meal with God. This priest signifies the Eucharist. When Melchizedek when Abraham ties to Melchizedek, Melchizedek fixes a feast of bread and wine, which signifies the Eucharist. The point is that there's no way that you could literally have every one of the Jewish ceremonies smushed into one. So the best way to do it is the way Jesus did it, by creating a meal. Now, if you look in the book of Acts, when they meet together to have the bread at the first of the week, they're not all doing a feast, right? There is a love feast that follows the ceremony that Paul mentions in the New Testament. But the liturgy itself doesn't have to be a feast, as if that's somehow essential to the ritual. The other way that we know this is that the apostles, when they went and established the churches, they gave the church an actual liturgy to do. We do the liturgy that's always been done. Read what Ignatius says about the liturgy in the first century. Read what Justin Martyr says in 150 AD about the liturgy. We still do the same liturgy that they talk about.
It's not just the liturgy, it's also like all the cycles that we do, that they're also similar to what the Old Testament believers do. So
Absolutely.
It's like all of our worship practice is the same, basically.
Because when I was told about, when he kind of like came back at me about this, when I talked to him about the real presence, he was like, well, I mean, technically, if we're going to be like, if you believe in it, then you should have a feast. And I was kind of like, that's not practical. Like, how would you have a feast for everybody? And I did mention the literal nature of the words of Jesus when he was speaking about communion and the blood and body of Christ. So, I mean, I think, so is it, you're coming from an angle of, I guess, like practicality in church history, not having that as a tradition, have like a full-on feast for every communion, every like at the Last Supper table type of thing.
Okay, but again, I mean,
Does anyone?
yeah, I mean, who actually does anybody? Nobody does this. This is like in other words, there's.
It was really weird. I didn't expect it. It's weird.
Yeah, I don't know. This sounds like some kind of Hebrew roots kind of thing. Like you have to do everything that was done, like in a ceremonial way, or it's invalid or something ridiculous like this.
Oh, I got a question. It's free.
Okay.
Is it good?
Yeah, go ahead.
By the way, I would say there's a couple books if a person wants an introduction to this issue. Just read Hugh Wybrew's book, The Orthodox Liturgy, because it's about how the Eucharistic liturgy developed in the Byzantine Rite. It relates back to the synagogue and temple worship, and then this book, Orthodox Worship, Living Continuity with the Synagogue, Temple, and Early Church. This is a really good book.
Are they two books, or would you say
two different books?
Liturgy?
One by Hugh Wybrew, Wibrew, and then a book by Benjamin Williams and Harold Anstall called Orthodox Worship.
Okay.
Next question.
First of all, good evening, Jay. Hope you're having a good day. And my basic question would be along the lines of, do you think Americanism, and I guess more generally the love of America and its ideals, would be compatible with strict adherence to Orthodox dogma and the traditions of the Church?
Right, so the church is not necessarily wedded to any political structure. The church has favored monarchy. It has the rite of coronation, which is a kind of sacramental rite of the coronation of kings. But the church can exist anywhere, even under governments that do not accept that or preach Americanism or whatever. So you can be a patriot, you can be a fan of your country insofar as your country's principles don't contradict Orthodox teaching, right? This is the same principle behind why the martyrs in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century went to death, was that they weren't rejecting the authority of the state inherently, but when Caesar overstepped his bounds and asked them to do things that violated the law of God. So there's a higher authority that trumps even Caesar. That was the reason why the martyrs were being put to death, is because they wouldn't admit that Caesar decides ultimately what gods are allowed and aren't. So, because you could believe any God you wanted to as long as you admitted Caesar was also God and had the final say-so, right? That's why the Christians were put to death, because they wouldn't admit that about Caesar. So in the same way, you could say that, you can grant to the American situation as much as is possible in terms of the positive aspects of the system, but there are aspects of the system which are not in concord with Orthodox theology. For example, it's not the case that the state should be ideally secular. That's not true.
Do you think that, and I'll leave it with this, do you think that America was inherently meant to be a secular nation?
Yeah, that's why we started with Thomas Paine. Now, that's a little hairy because you can say, oh, but some of the founding fathers believed in theism, some of them were Episcopalian, some of them were Catholic, one or two were Catholic, some of them were deists. So, I mean, yes and no. I mean, it's like when a Satanist says, I believe in a deity, and then I say, I believe in a deity, and a Muslim says, I believe in a deity. Do we all believe in a deity? Well, yeah, but does that mean we believe in the same deity? No. So is the American Constitution based on Christian principles or Enlightenment principles? Both. It's a mix. So there's not like an easy way out of this.
Yeah. All right, that pretty much answers my question. Thank you for your time, Jay.
Yeah, man.
Okay. What role? Okay, go ahead.
Just quick. Jay, you mentioned that Ratzinger denies the bodily resurrection of Jesus. Do you mind giving me a citation for that? I'm not doubting it.
I think it's at the end of Introduction to Christianity. Let me see.
Introduction to Christianity by Ratzinger.
I think. Yes, I think it's the last. The last chapter. The resurrection of the body, page 347, Introduction to Christianity. A lot of people have made a stink about it. I mean, he's actually got a whole bunch of he's got a whole bunch of modernist statements. It's not like, oh, there's just one. But of course, we don't really know what he means. He doesn't really say it. So they're just going to do the never-ending cope of, oh, he didn't really mean that. When he says that, he basically he says something like, we can't have this ancient view of it being like an actual body. We don't know what it is. It's just like this really vague thing about.
So Docetism is trad now.
Okay. What role does the British intelligence play in today's geopolitical climate, and who is in the driving seat?
I think that, you can just look at what all's happened in the last 8 months to see who's running things. Everything is run right now by the same people that have been running things since what I'm talking about in these books. It's the same power structure. It's the Anglo-Elite establishment, right? That includes U.S., U.K., Israel. They're all on the same team, and they are engaged in all the operations that you're seeing, like in Russia or in Ukraine. Montenegro, Ukraine, all of that stuff is the outplaying of this. It's all the same stuff.
Next question is, what is the Orthodox viewpoint of mortification of the flesh in Catholicism?
Read St. Gregory Palamas. We don't believe in mortification. Mortification is a erroneous doctrine of Catholicism that negates the body. Orthodoxy is very pro-body because of the resurrection. We stress the resurrection. We don't mortify the flesh. We believe the flesh is deified. So we do practice asceticism, but that's not the same thing as mortifying the flesh. Mortifying the flesh is based on a mistranslation, I think, in the Vulgate.
Right. Does Actus Purus make or attempt to make the Trinity into a monad?
it doesn't attempt to, it attempts to have a philosophical definition and explication of what simplicity is and how to do natural theology based on philosophic first principles. But it unfortunately precludes and negates the Trinitarian doctrines, which necessitate real distinctions in the Trinity, and, for example, one hypostasis being able to enter into a mode of being that the other two do not. Namely, the Son becomes incarnates and dies, the Father and the Spirit do not. So you need a Trinitarian theology that allows for that and doesn't preclude it by its simplicity doctrine. So Actus Purus also necessitates an eternal creator, an eternal creation, that the eternal actualizer is actualizing and moving. It means that all possible worlds have to be actualized. There's no potentia in God. I mean, it has all these problems that just really don't line up with what's needed to have Orthodox Trinitarian and Christological teaching.
Okay. What is the major problems you see with using relations of opposition to distinguish members of the Trinity?
Well, first and foremost, they're not the distinctions that are already codified and used and confirmed by the Cappadocians. So Athanasius and the Cappadocians have a very specific, very consistent, clear doctrine of how to explicate and pick out the persons. There's nothing about relations of opposition until Augustine and later Latin theologians. So all I really have to do is just point out that Constantinople I dogmatically affirms the Cappadocian and Athanasian interpretation of the Creed. So that precludes any relations of opposition just from the outset on a dogmatic stance. But beyond that, relations of opposition literally makes absolutely no sense in the Trinity, because the Trinity is a triad, not a dyad. Opposition relates to dyad. God is not a dyad. The Trinity is not a dyad. There's no such thing as relations of opposition in a triad by definition. So that's problematic. But also, the persons are not relations. The persons are subjects. And this is, I think, Lossky's critique, which is to say that Thomas is wrong when he says persona et relatio, and he only says persona et relatio because of absolute divine simplicity. But a relation is a predicate, not a subject, and the persons are subjects. So you can't define a subject by a predicate or a relation.
Next question is, in a writing I was reading on the Bogomil heresy, the writer stated the Latins were still using the liturgy made by Peter. So could you argue that the Catholics not preserving the liturgy of Peter is evidence, in a sense, against either papal infallibility or papal supremacy?
By the liturgy made by Peter, are you talking about the Gregorian liturgy?
Perhaps we could unmute him or wait for him to clarify that question, because that is a very interesting caveat.
Yeah, if he wants to, he can just type question.
I mean, I'm not a historian of the history of the Latin liturgy. I mean, I know about the major reforms, the Gregorian reforms. I know about what happened under different popes, Pius, and these people with De Defectibus and all this kind of stuff. So, but I don't know how. I mean, I guess some people would say that's the liturgy of Peter. I mean, it's not typically the way the trads speak. They just talk about the Gregorian rite. But I mean, Western Rite Orthodox churches will use the Gregorian liturgy. So I'm not sure what you mean by the Petrine liturgy.
Yeah, I guess my question was like somewhat more related to like, did he make a liturgy in a sense? So it was kind of two questions in one.
I don't know that we probably don't know. So actually, there's quite a bit about the 1st and 2nd century that we don't know. I'm not saying that there aren't scholars who don't have knowledge of this or a theory on this. I'm just saying I don't personally know. I'm not a liturgical scholar. I have some familiarity with some of this stuff with patristics, but liturgics is kind of its own domain. And I don't know exactly. It would probably have to look at Tertullian or Hippolytus, and they could probably have insights into how the early Latin liturgy would have been done. But I don't actually know. That's a good question.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Next, Scout Top Soltis had a question. If you could unmute and ask your question, go ahead.
Yeah, so in a recent video, Jay, that you had on tag, you talked about how it's necessary for there to be a Trinity, because otherwise you end up with a situation where God is contingent on creation,
right? Because
otherwise he doesn't have a thing to be like God of, right? Am I representing that correctly?
Right.
And so I was just wondering how that exactly works with like the Son and the Holy Spirit, because I get that like the Father as the monarch would be, the monarch of the Son and the Holy Spirit, but would the Son like be the God of the Father and the Holy Spirit, would it work that way too?
No. The those kind of terms would be like the Father would still have a primacy in terms of being the cause, the unoriginate, the fountain, the beginning. But we don't import into those terms anything to do with temporal power or supremacy. So the Father, in generating a Son that is his icon or his direct image, also communicates to him the same divine nature that he possesses. Just as a human father gives birth to a human son, they have the same nature even though they're distinct persons. So that's just an analogy for how in the Trinity, the Son being the Son of the Father, Jesus says all these statements in the book of John, like, I came to show you the Father, to direct you to the Father. I came to only do what the Father says. I only follow what the Father tells me to do. I commit I only do his will. So he's in full subjection to the Father, right? So the Father is given primacy in the sense that he's the Father, but he also, Jesus says, for the Father has given the Son to have life in himself. Right? The Father has given everything that he possesses to the Son. So the Father communicates and gives out of self-love, out of true love to the other, to his Son, the full community of divine power that he possesses. Right? So there's no lacking in what Jesus has. So in other words, it's not like an either or where we're saying that God and Lord only apply to a created order. We're saying that the reason that God doesn't require a created order to be Lord is because the Father has a Son, and the Father and the Son share a communion of love, which is the Spirit in a manifestation sense. So
does that mean that the Son and the Holy Spirit would require creation in order to be Lord of something?
No, because that's the point of that they share that love to one another. So, in other words, the Son returns the love back to the Father. Simultaneously, the Father loves the Spirit, and the Spirit loves the Son and the Father. So that communion is shared amongst all three. And so the point is that there is a mutual communion that occurs that doesn't require the property of in other words, we say that God, in the sense of being Lord or providence or God over something, that's only an attribute that God takes on in relation to creation. So he wasn't providential or creator before he created. We don't believe in an eternal creator.
All right, gotcha. Thank you.
But what I'm saying, I see your objection. I'm trying to phrase it right. You're saying that if the Trinity bypasses the problem of saying that God needed a creation to be Lord over, then doesn't the Son and the Spirit lack the property of being God or Lord? But God and Lord are, or we're saying he's obviously God from all eternity, but sometimes people will say the definition of God is to be God of creation. So in that sense, we don't say he's God. If by God you mean God the Father, then yes, he's God the Father from all eternity. Father of who? Greater than who? Greater than the Son, in the sense of being the origin of the Son.
Alrighty, gotcha. Makes sense. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, next question is there a theological reasoning that led to the entire Orthodox Church adopting the Byzantine Rite? And then he says, after the Chalcedon schism, the Church of Antioch adopted the Byzantine Rite and abandoned the Syriac Rite. In the 12th century, the Georgian Church adopted the Byzantine Rite and dropped the Armenian tradition. And in the 16th century, the Russian Church made their rites conformative to the Greeks, causing the Old Believer Schism.
But aside from just the historical instances, I don't know that there's some overriding decision to do that. I mean, there's nothing inherently necessarily wrong with the other rites per se. And I think even on Mount Athos, the liturgy of St. James is celebrated sometimes, right? Which is the Alexandrian liturgy. So it's not infallibly the case that that's always but it's rather that it just becomes more and more normative, and everybody kind of wants to do things in harmony, I guess. So it's not that they're defective, but it's kind of like the Western Rite. It's not that the Gregorian Rite is necessarily bad, but what happens is that a lot of times people will bring their theological baggage and assumptions into the Latin liturgy, and they don't get the good theology that's present in the Byzantine liturgy. So it's more so maybe pragmatic reasons than it is like some sort of inherent defect, I would say. But I'm also not a liturgical scholar. That's not my forte.
Okay, the next question is, how is it possible that the academic consensus on the works of St. Dionysius places its true authorship as some pseudonymous writer almost 500 years later than tradition? It seems that such a huge disparity in dating should be easily resolvable through textual analysis, historical citations, and so forth. This strikes me as an important issue since it gives ammunition to those claiming the EE distinction in orthodoxy is just cribbed from Neoplatonism. Even Orthodox Wiki sees to the academic consensus. Do the academics have that strong of a case?
Okay, first of all, go read David Bradshaw's book, Aristotle East and West, and you will see that the essence-centered distinction is not predicated on Dionysius and the divine names. Dionysius and the divine names does make the essence-centered distinction. The essence-centered distinction is completely contrary to Neoplatonism. I'm not trying to be rude, but if you understood the essence-centered distinction, you would know that it's employed to refute Neoplatonism. I can't stress this enough. I get tired of constantly saying this to the Roman Catholics and to the Thomists. When Basil writes about the essence-centered distinction, he's arguing against people who have Platonic assumptions of simplicity. The essence-energy distinction refutes Neoplatonism. Now, is there a similarity between Neoplatonism and what's in Dionysius? Yes, I don't think anybody disputes that. However, what theoretically could be disputed, if you read the Staniloy essay at Ortho-Christian about the dating of Dionysius, there is a defense of Dionysius being Dionysius. So I would recommend that essay at Ortho-Christian, defense of the dating of Dionysius or something like that, on the title of St. Dionysius, something like that. But setting that issue aside, the other possibility, it also could be the case that, as I was saying to that guy about the Latin liturgy, I don't think people realize that when it comes to these 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century stuff, there's a lot that we don't know, okay? Manuscripts are being discovered all the time. There's new stuff that comes about. So textual criticism and reconstruction involves a lot of guesswork. I'm not saying that it can't be done. I'm not saying that we've had textual scholars on. So I'm not trying to be overly simplistic. I recognize the nuances. I'm just saying that, for example, it could be the case that the present documents that we have of Dionysius are later additions that do include Neoplatonic phraseology and terms. So it's not like it has to be some either or, like, well, either there was a dude named Dionysius who composed all of that treatise, or maybe there's a redacted one that we have that's from the 4th or 5th century that is based on a smaller corpus of the real Dionysius. I mean, we just don't know. So in other words, when you read about textual scholarship, I'm not saying you haven't read. I don't know who you are or what you have or haven't read. I'm just making the point that one thing that you'll notice is that it's a lot of guesswork. Remember when we had Dr. James Snap on and we were talking about the certain codices that have the giant space left out for the ending place of Mark? So he's speculating with reasonable speculation that a lot of these codices had a parenthesis where there would fit the ending part of Mark's gospel. So he reasonably assumes that the ending part of Mark's gospel is supposed to be there. It's just missing in certain manuscripts because some of the copyists didn't know what to do with the ellipses. So there's a whole dispute that's perhaps solved on the basis of one speculation. But we don't know, right? Because a lot of textual stuff is reconstructing things that nobody knows for sure. How much more with ancient texts like Dionysius, right? We just don't know. So I'm not a Dionysius scholar. I don't claim to know about this, but I do trust the tradition of the church, and there are defenses of the argument. But before any of that, even the world authority on Dionysius, Bishop Alexander Golitsyn, who does not believe that Dionysius is Dionysius, he accepts the pseudo thing. Even in his essays, he argues that the real origin of Dionysius' theology is Ezekiel and the chariot Merkava mysticism, which is true. So if the origin is not even Plotinus, then it really doesn't matter if there's a later similarity between Plotinian phraseology and imagery and celestial hierarchies or whatever. It doesn't really matter because nobody denies there's similarities in understandings of this or that. But if you read the divine names, it's almost all citations from Scripture, right? So he's talking to philosophers, trying to speak to them in philosophic language. But one thing that's really important about orthodoxy is that a lot of these terms are not synonymous with the Hellenic meaning of the terms, right? Logos, logi, a great example of this, when St. Maximus utilizes the logi doctrine, which is from Plotinus, he alters it in three significant ways. He makes the logi to be free will actions of God. They're not emanations. They're not determined generations. They're necessary. And he makes them only relate to the created order, and thus God can freely do it. And he makes them personal. He makes them inhypostatic. So is the phrase logi in Plotinus? Yes. Is the phrase logi in Maximus? Yes. Does that mean that Maximus teaches Plotinian Neoplatonism? No, because he significantly alters it in three key areas that make it no longer Neoplatonic and now Christian, because he makes them energies.
Okay. Next question is in two parts. It's quite a long one. So we'll do first part and second part. So in response to Catholics concerning the Filioque doctrine, why does the Son proceeding from the will of the Father necessitate the Son as created if the Father could eternally will the Son's existence?
Because if you read Athanasius, that's an Arian argument. Athanasius rejects the Arian argument that the Son is generated by will. He specifically states that he's not generated by will. He's generated directly of the Father's nature. And it is not, there's no interposition of will. This is what the Arians and then Eunomius argues, is that the Son is a work of energy and will. No, he's not. He's a direct, natural generation of the Father's essence. So, it's the Father as hypostasis with the divine nature. The divine nature is inhypostatized in the person of the Father who generates the Son of his nature, you see. So it's inhypostatic. Even the generation is inhypostatic. It's of the Father's nature. So when the Son is generated, it is not by will, because anything that's by will is common to the Godhead. It's common to all three persons, such as creating the world. Father, Son, and Spirit create the world. Even redemption, even if there's different modes of the persons, right? The Son becomes incarnate and dies, not the Father, not the Spirit. Even those actions are common to the Godhead, but they're actualized or they are brought to reality in three unique modes of existence. So therefore, the Spirit cannot be proceeding by will, because that would mean he's a creature. That would mean that the Father and the Son create the Spirit, because anything by will is common to the Godhead. And if it's common to the Godhead, then all three do it, or this makes no sense, right? So that's just taking the Arian argument about the Son being an act of God's will and applying it to the Holy Spirit. Now the Holy Spirit would be an act of God's will and therefore a creature. That's why Athanasius says the Son is not generated by will. He's God of God, light of light. There's no interposition of will.
And the second part of the question is, if the Spirit shares the same essence with the Father, and the Spirit is generated from the Father's essence / nature, why wouldn't the criticism that we put forth, namely that the Spirit, being a product of the Father's will and sharing the same will as the Father, resulting in the Spirit spiriting
How can it be a product of will if it shares the same will? It makes no sense. The Spirit is a product of the spiration of the Father, not the will of the Father, because Father, Son, and Spirit share one will. Will is a faculty of nature, not person. So all of this nonsense, and if this is directly from Ludwig Ott in his Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma, he says the Holy Spirit proceeds by will. No, he doesn't. No more than the Son is generated by will. Why not? Because the Father, Son, and Spirit have one will. They all share the same will. And nobody, if they all share the same will, then nobody would affirm that the Holy Spirit wills himself, right? He doesn't generate, or he doesn't process himself. Therefore, he cannot proceed by will. It's a fundamental blunder.
Next question is, several Western scholars claim epistles 1 through 3 John are forgeries developed by the medieval church. How can we debunk this nonsensical theory?
Well, I can debunk that right away, because the church fathers cite these epistles. So that's ludicrous. I mean, I can give you, read any of the major church fathers will include the Catholic epistles in their canon, their list of the canon. Athanasius includes, going from memory, the Catholic epistles. So that's on its face ludicrous. That it would be a medieval invention. That's preposterous. You could debunk that in about 2 minutes with Google.
Yeah. Next question is, for someone looking to convert to Orthodoxy, what's with the schism with Constantinople and Moscow? Where can I learn about it, and would it reflect on which jurisdiction I join?
Could you repeat the last part? You're looking to convert in what?
He wants to know what is the circumstance with the schism with Constantinople and Moscow, and where can he learn about it?
Well, a lot of what I've talked about in tonight's stuff geopolitically will relate to that, right? So we're talking about stuff in the 50s and 60s in tonight's talk, but the same issues are what undergird today's problems between Moscow and Constantinople. So the divide there has progressed to a certain point in canonical church discipline where there's a removal of communion. That's the stage right before formal excommunication. So we would not yet say that everybody in communion with Bartholomew has lost grace, but we are at the stage before the next step would be formal excommunication. At that point, we would say that you have to leave EP churches and Go Arch churches. We don't necessarily say that yet, but you can already see the degradation of the Go Arch churches in the U.S. They're pretty bad. Not every one of them, but some of them. So, long story short, find the best church around you by visiting all of them and see which one is the most solid. That's the best solution.
Okay. Next question is, it's a historical question. What would you say to those who seek to undermine the saintly character of St. Cyril of Alexandria by accusing him of having something to do with the murder which was carried out by a mob against Hypatia?
I think there's a Catholic. I saw a Catholic article that debunks this pretty easily. I would just I don't even remember where I found that article, but Also, there's a book. Just read John McGuckin's book. I think he covers this as well. So, yeah. Off the top of my head, I don't remember what the solution is. It's getting late. I'm getting kind of tired. So, is there any more easy ones? Maybe we can call it to a close here.
Yeah, there's. I think there's some short ones. If the Father and Son are different persons with the same essence, like a human Father and Son, what differentiates this from polytheism?
No, the analogy is made between a father and a son just to show at the level of nature, right? A father gives birth to a son who possesses the same nature. That's all the analogy is intended to show. Obviously, humans are two distinct beings. The Father and the Son are not separate, distinct beings. So I'm not extending the level of analogy beyond just possessing the same nature.
Right. This is one. Did Saint Justin think the Son's begetting was by the will of the Father? What do we make of that?
I think that there's one statement in Justin that people call into question from memory. But I think there's also other statements in St. Justin where he seems to pretty consistently uphold the eternal generation. But there is a sense in which, for example, we were talking about this the other day in the Discord with Luce. You could, in a, like if there's a term for this type of willing. You could call it something like willing by acquiescence. Like if I have a son, and he's the direct offspring of my nature, I'm also at the same time, in a sense, willing him to be, right? So just because I'm agreeing with what happens according to nature, doesn't mean that I am causing it to happen by will. Does that make sense?
Do you want to go any further?
How many more left?
A few.
There's also a couple super chats, Jay.
All right, let's see. So all I see is one super chat from Nico. It says, "Thank you, Jay." You're welcome, Nico. Much appreciated.
Yeah, we have like 8 more questions.
Oh man.
If you want, we can just call it here, and everyone write down your questions. Okay, so you don't forget them, and ask another time.
Well, yeah, I'll just continue in the Discord for the last